Alright, so I need to get something out of the way immediately, because if I don't, then no one is going to want to watch this video. The audio quality that you hear right now, and that you will hear throughout the opening and the introduction, is not the audio quality of the vast majority of this series. So you will not have to be listening to all this static and occasional, weird adjustment sound in the background, or I don't know, maybe my grandfather clock will have some bell chimes as I'm recording this segment, so don't worry. None of it except for this part is bad. What happened is that I attempted to record this opening segment, but for some reason my microphone didn't work, at all, and nothing I could possibly do to it made it work again. So I'm actually recording this using my desktop camera microphone, which I use for, I don't know, just people still use Zoom and things of that nature. So I'm sorry, don't worry, it won't be like this throughout the rest of the video. Over the past 2 years, I've been completely rewriting the entirety of Season 1 of The Rings of Power, just in time for Season 2 to come out. Would you look at that? After this was done, I thought it best to release all the episodes into one large movie, or rather podcast, so that the listening experience can be as direct and simple as possible. Obviously, with how little visuals there are throughout the series, I'm in no small part expecting that you will likely use it as something to listen to in the background while doing homework, the dishes, or driving, and that, in my opinion, is a perfectly good use of this video. I will also be explaining the parameters of the series briefly, but I've left timestamps for each episode if you would simply like to skip to the actual rewrite. My reason for doing this rewrite was that I thought it would be a good exercise for my own personal talents, as well as give a definite contrast to what could have been achieved with the most basic elements of subtlety and respect for the source material they were writing about. You see, I'm not yet a professional writer, but I do know how to write a story, and as such I immediately knew that I could have written a much better story than what this show actually produced, and therefore I adopted a set of restrictions for how I could do this rewrite just to make things more difficult for myself. First restriction is that I made it so that the story had to take place within the same time range as what they had in the show within the context of Middle-earth. This, of course, was not strictly possible, seeing as they had the events of Middle-earth from around 1500 to 1600 Second Age, while the events in Numenor are loosely adapted from the very end of the Second Age. As such, I chose circa 1600 SA time frame, which was the more important part of the show in the forging of the Rings of Power. You know, what the show is called, and allegedly what it's about. The second restriction is that I decided that all the major characters from the show had to appear in this rewrite, or where necessary had to have analogues. To avoid spoilers, I will not list all the examples, but Gil-galad, Galadriel, Elrond, Celebrimbor, Arondir, and Bronwyn all appear throughout my rewrite, while Halbrand, Durin, Nori, and the Numenoreans have parallel characters. Fun fact, they could have actually had an accurate Numenorean queen if they had just set the Rings of Power in the actual time of the forging of the rings, but for some reason they decided not to do that, which is stupid. Anyway, the third restriction was that all characters and their parallels must begin in more or less, this is important, the same place, and relatively doing the same actions. Furthermore, I said that the general plot beats needed to have a similar format to what happened in the actual show. Thus, Galadriel and others must be fighting in the north at the beginning, a stranger must arrive near the Harfoots, Gil-galad must send Elrond to Celebrimbor, etc. for the beginning, while the Numenoreans must have a similar fate befall them during the story. There will still be a big battle towards the end, the three rings must be forged by Celebrimbor at the end of the season, Arondir, Bronwyn, and the Southlanders must go off to make a new life, etc. And finally, I decided to stick to the time structure of the show. That is, my rewrite would be 8 episodes long, with each episode being about an hour. Now, since you can see that this video is only 4 hours long, I did not make each of my rewrite episodes an hour long. The reasons for this is that this isn't actually a screenplay, and additional time would need to be given to an actual production for scene setting, downtime, and all the extra stuff that goes into making a watching experience for a TV show enjoyable. Now, to be clear, this is not the story I wanted to write, and after writing this, I've determined that I'm probably never going to do something like this again. I'll have more on that in a video later this week, but for now, grab some popcorn or your headphones, sit back or stand up while doing chores, and enjoy me exploring the question, what if the Rings of Power was actually good?
For episode 1, I would simply cut the prologue, as it added little to the show other than a brief sense of visual spectacle, and what little information we were given from it generally detracted from any of the proper moral dynamics of the Second Age. If it is absolutely necessary to include the prologue, I would frame it as Elrond being approached by elf students as the lore master of Lindon. He would then sorrowfully tell the tale of the ban on the High Elves and their gradual destruction by Morgoth, until his father, Eärendil, was able to request the Valar for aid. Since this story was already in the actual show, I don't see any reason not to bring it up in the prologue, so here we are. I would then have the elves ask Elrond what happened to the orcs and other monsters after Morgoth's downfall. Elrond would mention how many of the monsters, such as the Balrogs, fled from the wrath of the Valar, though we know not where they now rest. Others, like the dragons, are found in the various corners of the world nursing their greed. But the orcs, they have largely faded into a loose set of tribes, disorganized, vicious, and cruel, as much to themselves as to outsiders. I do not doubt, he says, they soon will fade from this world unless some other dark mind and hand takes up the mantle of master for them. As he's speaking, the camera gradually rises, and we look at a map of Middle-earth in the room, which zooms in on the mountains of Angmar. From this, we transition to a relatively small elvish army led by Gil-galad, and it should be noted that if this show were not to have a prologue, which is my preferred option, this is where the show would begin. Celeborn and Galadriel are accompanying Gil-galad with their own entourage, but it's nevertheless clear that he's the one in command. Galadriel begins to speak on the prudence of committing this large of an army to their task, at which point Gil-galad points out that this mission was her idea in the first place. Celeborn then interjects, saying that her suggestion was that they discover what force leads the orcs of the north, not that they commit to a full-scale invasion. Gil-galad then points out that he has no plan or desire to occupy these lands once their task is finished. The size of his force is sufficient for any pitched battle with the remainder of the orcs in the north. But if your suspicions prove true, Galadriel, this force will still be small enough to retreat with ease when we are confronted with the greater power at work. Galadriel smiles at this, commenting on how she did well to make sure Gil-galad was the one who became High King. Gil-galad, while feigning exasperation at her insistence, nevertheless agrees that he has indeed worked hard to repay her trust in him, and that he believes he has succeeded. One of the scouts then reports to Gil-galad that the men of Angmar are besieged on a hilltop, and that they are holding out against a coalition of orc tribes. Celeborn comments on how said tribes should never have been able to cooperate, and Galadriel finishes by saying, unless there is some higher mind behind their actions. Gil-galad, with a grim expression, bids them wait until they have something more tangible for evidence. He informs his lieutenant that they ride for the encampment of men. They will rout the orcs and discover what the origin of their coalition is. We are then introduced to Varix, the king of the people of Angmar. He is a fairly short man compared to the elves, but has a strong and commanding build. He is, however, rather old and shows some mild limitations to his movement. He is going about on foot, checking each of the camps to see how well they are holding up in light of the surrounding orcs. He watches the growing camps of the orcs with his deep, intent eyes as the sky begins to darken. He then declares to his people that the orcs will attack at night. We will be ready for them, and they shall fall upon our spears like rain upon the mountain. The people cheer, and he retreats into his tent, wherein we begin to see him take off the facade, and we see him beg something, we know not what. Please, give my people the strength to last the night. Just after this prayer, we see tears begin to roll down his cheeks as he moves towards a chest in the center of his tent, and we see that he is extremely hesitant to open it. He is just about to make up his mind to do so when we hear the sounds of fighting outside, though it seems too distant to be his own men. Varix prepares himself and walks outside, but is surprised to find that the orcs are not fighting his men, but against a group of elves. He makes the snap decision to rally together his people to help them. They do so and make a charge on foot. Meanwhile, Varix climbs onto his horse and attempts to go to whom he perceives to be the commander of the force of elves, which is an elvish warrior who seems to be almost shining in his rich armor. The elf notices him, and the two talk as the battle ensues, with the orcs very rapidly breaking and retreating towards the mountains. The elf laughs at the notion that he is the commander or king of this force, and points Varix to Gil-galad, Galadriel, and Celeborn, who are overlooking the battle on a nearby hill. Galadriel and Celeborn are specifically watching for any sign of a higher authority amongst the orcs. Celeborn notes how the orcs are largely retreating into separate groups, likely along the lines of chiefdoms, which is a good thing, he points out. Galadriel agrees, displaying for a moment the sorrow of realizing your opinion might be wrong, while at the same time being relieved that your worst fears have not been realized. Gil-galad is consulting with his lieutenant, and just as they are getting ready to pursue the orcs into the mountains, the elf soldier from earlier begs leave of the High King to introduce the leader of the humans they had had saved. Varix introduces himself with all the dignity he can muster and what little Sindarin he knows, and thanks them for the rescue. Galadriel then tells him in his own tongue that his presence is welcome among the elves and that they are more than pleased to save all the enemies of the orcs. Varix expresses his surprise that she knows his tongue, mentioning how he has heard mention of the elves in his long years, but this is the first time ever truly meeting one. I had not expected to meet even a single elf in my lifetime, and now I've been presented with a whole host of them. Galadriel smiles and thanks Varix for his courtesy, but then turns to Gil-galad and says that she and Celeborn will guide the humans to the completion of their mission. Very good, says Gil-galad. These men seem stout of heart, and similar to our great friends across the sea. I hope that they shall prove as worthy. He then speaks words of encouragement to Varix in as simple Sindarin as he can muster, which Varix seems to understand well enough, before heading off to rally the soldiers together so that they can chase after the orcs. Galadriel, after watching him go, turns to Varix and says that she has had great interest in human allies for many centuries now, and has therefore made something of an effort to learn their language. Varix says that she handles it beautifully. Celeborn admits that he's less familiar with the tongue of the Northmen than his wife, but he will no doubt prove passable for the purposes of their acquaintance. The three then follow Gil-galad's host with their entourages until they come to the mountains. There, they see that the orcs have effectively regrouped and mounted a successful defense on a large fortress built into the side of the mountain. Their defense is so successful, in fact, that the relatively small elvish force has difficulty with completely breaking through it. It is then that Varix offers his assistance, noting to Galadriel and Celeborn that these orcs generally have difficulty with properly maintaining fortresses of this scale, and therefore they should check for weaknesses in the walls. Intrigued, Celeborn asks if there's any one place in particular they should check, and Varix mentions the towers and walls closest to the rock. Celeborn then passes this information on to Gil-galad, who sends a few spies to get closer to those parts of the fortifications. Sure enough, there are a number of weaknesses in the maintenance of the stonework, though Gil-galad sees no obvious way to undermine them without building siege weapons. Varix then once again states that he might be able to help, as his people have access to weapons made just for this situation. Galadriel speaks on his behalf to Gil-galad, who accepts, and thus Varix, after crafting the plan with Galadriel, sneaks up to the side of the fortress with a couple of other men, unseen. In our next shot, we see the walls beginning to crumble, which draws the attention of the orcs away from the main gate. Then, the full might of the small elvish host assaults the main gate, and the will of the orcs to defend it vanishes. The elves get inside and find the orc defenders have broken down in terms of discipline, and are easily separated and cut down by the elves. Varix then meets up once again with the Galadriel and Celeborn, and, along with Gil-galad, they begin to root out all the hidden strongholds in the fortress. A reference is made to how, if they don't do this, none could predict what evils would continue to fester in this land. Celeborn notes that there is something almost elvish about this man, referencing Varix, how he displays wisdom and strength even absent among our great scholars and warriors. After some time, a morning light begins to shine over the tops of the mountains, and an eagle can be seen circling in the air. Nevertheless, the rooting out takes several hours at least, until at last they find the great chief of this loose coalition of orcs. It seems, after this investigation, that there is no higher mind behind this orc coalition, which Varix confirms seem to have joined mainly to oppose his kingdom. Galadriel, Celeborn, and Gil-galad discuss the meaning of this in Quenya, and they are all relieved to find out that neither the Balrogs nor any other servant of Morgoth seems to be behind these orcs. We may have to accept the fact that the enemy has truly been defeated, says Gil-galad. I would not dismiss the rumors just yet, Galadriel retorts. Nevertheless, I agree. It is time for a change of tactic. If the enemy is still lurking about, he likely won't remain in the west. Not while we're here. Indeed, Celeborn says, we may very well be playing into his tricks by hunting down every small band of orcs. For now, we may need to wait and watch for larger signs. After a few other words, the three of them agree to celebrate the victory and be more cautious in their plans. After all of them have rested, they begin to discuss what to do with the fortress, eventually inviting Varix into the conversation to help them make their final decision. The others, with Galadriel at the forefront, express their desire to have it destroyed. Varix, however, asks that this fortress be left for his people. We have scarcely had the strength to create great strongholds of our own, since those skills have been lost in our war against the orcs. I believe, however, if we were to take this fortress and make it our own, we could establish a new realm for ourselves. Perhaps, one day, We could prove a formidable ally to the High King. He nods to Gil-galad as he says this, who agrees to this reasoning, and recognizes Varix as the ruler of this fortress and the surrounding lands, encouraging Galadriel and Celeborn to do so as well. After this, we see the elves preparing to move home while the people of Angmar occupy the fortress. Galadriel and Celeborn invite Varix and members of his court to come with them to celebrate the feast in Lindon. After all, they say, it seems only proper that one who has had so large a part in their swift victory today should also share in the fruits of their triumph. Varix agrees to come, knowing that he has little time left and much to learn about how to run a kingdom, and elects to bring what members of his people he can while leaving his cousin there to rule. He tells the people that he knows not how long he will be away from them, but he knows that, with the help of the elves, he will be a changed man if he returns. As the small host leaves, the eagle we saw earlier comes down to speak briefly with Gil-galad. He says that Manwë, the king of the Valar, has sent a messenger to Middle-earth, and that said messenger will be coming to Lindon within a year or so. Now, depending on whether the prologue has been kept, we are then introduced to Elrond in his study. He is performing the rather mundane, but still important task of copying a manuscript which he has been studying onto new parchment. He is silent throughout the scene, nevertheless, it is clear that his mind is at work, as he seems to come to a realization, getting up from his desk and going to check a scroll. Before he is able to do this, however, he is informed that the High King is returning. Immediately, he rises and makes preparations for the return celebrations. Gil-galad arrives at the main gate of the capital of Lindon, which can be let's just say it's Mithlund, because why not? And immediately a reverent fear of him can almost be felt amongst the elves who have come to welcome him. Elrond bows to the High King as he greets him at the gate, and graciously welcomes the Lady Galadriel and Lord Celeborn. While being respectful, he eyes Varix for a moment, who, along with his followers, looks gruff and uncultured by comparison to the rich fabrics of the elves. Galadriel introduces him as the King of Angmar, the newly established realm hard bought by the blood of his people. Elrond bows and expresses his condolences for his people's suffering. Varix, however, says that such is the way of war with a ruthless enemy, though he hopes that at long last his people's suffering has ended. Based on how eloquently he speaks, it becomes clear that Celeborn and Galadriel have been helping him practice Sindarin. Gil-galad expresses his approval, and says that if his people show the valor and cleverness they expressed these past few weeks, he has no doubt that they shall find their own path in the world. We then begin the feast. Galadriel and Celeborn are, of course, sitting next to each other on the side of the high table, with a place for Gil-galad reserved in the high seat on one end while Varix sits on the other. One can see that he feels rather awkward and out of place amongst the grand finery in the great hall, but he also glances at his entourage, seated at another table a short distance away, and notices that they are looking to him, and therefore he musters all the propriety, courage, and dignity he can among such eminent guests. Three men, far more richly dressed than Varix and his entourage, but slightly less so than the elves, are already seated at the table. It is soon realized by Varix and his followers that these are the fabled Men of the Sea, Numenoreans. They are introduced to each other by Galadriel and Celeborn, and we learn their names. The eldest and leader of the Numenorean guests is a man named Isilmo, who is the cousin of the reigning queen of Numenor. With him is his cousin Valinor, and between them is his son Ministir. Valinor, and to some degree Ministir, express friendlier attitudes towards the people of Angmar, but Isilmo, while still adhering to the proper courtesies, expresses a largely patronizing attitude towards the people, and especially towards their king. Valinor is somewhat anxious at his cousin's treatment of their brethren, and therefore offers to walk with Varix after the feast, which Varix feels he cannot decline. Regardless, all three of the Numenoreans show great reverence even to the lowliest of elves, and are the first to stand once Elrond and Gil-galad approach the table to announce the beginning of the feast. Similar to the entrance gate of the city, the hall becomes silent once Gil-galad moves to raise his voice. Once the feast begins, Gil-galad, Celeborn, Galadriel, and Isilmo discuss the recent events throughout Eriador and beyond, and we are introduced to a variety of names and places and events, though these are largely contextualized in terms of the characters' opinions of them. Tirharad, which Varix roughly translates to near south or the Southlands for his soon-to-be scribe, is apparently a place of relative danger, though, Celeborn mentions, some of our distant brethren to the east have been assisting the lords of that land. Indeed, Valinor confirms. We have had close contact with the Sylvan elves of the area. They have done well to lift up the men of those parts. I dare say that they are one of the most prosperous people outside of Numenor in our havens here on Middle-earth. By contrast, the East is largely agreed by all present to be a dangerous place, though each speaker has a different opinion as to why. The Numenoreans attribute the trouble to the lack of high kingdoms, with only corrupt kings attempting to supplant each other. Gil-galad attributes it to the lack of high elfish presence, and Galadriel and Celeborn generally agree with Gil-galad. Nevertheless, they argue that they know fewer things about that land, and therefore there could be some power looking there, leading the men to destruction. Gil-galad then asks Elrond for his opinion, and we see that Elrond has been intently following the discussion. We get a glimpse of the deep, thoughtful mind behind his grey eyes, somehow both quick and cautious, young and vigorous, and yet containing the memory of countless ages, beyond what he, as one of the youngest of the elves, ought to know. He waits for a moment to consider his answer before saying, "As to the true answer, we cannot be sure. However, it is clear from our mutual history that all children of Iluvatar, be they man or elf, are vulnerable to corruption, if not directly by dark powers, then to their own greed, or overlove of the good things they have made." As he says these words, we see Galadriel and Celeborn bow their heads slightly. Regardless, the strands of evil stretch far throughout the world, for the corruption of Morgoth cannot wholly be cured. I do not think it is wise to search for a single cause for the evils of any land, especially for one so far beyond our sight. It is often the case that an apparent source will show itself, but when one begins the work of eradicating it, they find the roots are much deeper and more extensive than ever before believed. Everyone at the table is impressed with Elrond's thoughtfulness, with Galadriel commenting that it is indeed foolish for them to be making declarations about a land of which they know little. Gil-galad agrees that he may have been too hasty in making his judgment about the other realms. "I shall have to think more on all the implications of your words, my friend, for you have now brought much to light which has been on my mind." After the feast, we see Gil-galad return to his chamber and Elrond to the library, at last able to find the scroll he was attempting to reach earlier. Varix and Valandil walk about the halls of Mithland, looking out towards the sea. Valandil is explaining to him the ways of the elves and the Numenoreans, displaying the confidence that even if Varix were ill-intentioned, he would have no ability to harm the Numenoreans or the Havens. Varix listens eagerly, but eventually asks why he would tell him all this. Valandil says that, though the High Elves are gracious and joyful in their own right, at times it can be comforting to be welcomed by your own people. Varix mentions how the Numenoreans are not truly his people, which Valandil, laughing, says he supposes to be true. And yet, we are not too different. I have heard tell that our ancestors were once one, though mine went further west, and thus fought the great war against the enemy. Morgoth? Varix asks. Yes, the one who enslaved and tortured our people, and sought to either destroy or possess all that is good in the world. It pains me that so many men went over to serve him, and still do. Some of them among my ancestors and yours, but never again. Numenor may fear and hate the darkness, but we will never serve it, now that its face has been revealed. How did your people create their own path? Varix says suddenly. What do you mean? Gil-galad spoke of my people making a path for themselves in the world, but I know not of what he speaks. Ah, he hopes that you will one day become strong and dignified enough that you may seek after your own glories and great works. This is what Numenoreans have done. We began as a wandering people till we were granted the Isle of Gift. Since then we have made great works, and crafted a name for ourselves equal in power, though not in dignity, to the High Elves. If the tales of your valor are true, I do not doubt that you shall do this as well. But you ask how one is to accomplish this? The simple answer for now is that you must be guided by others. How shall my people make a path for themselves if we allow ourselves to be guided by others? A fair question, and a great paradox it is. But think of the child. How, if not guided and taught by those who know, he remains wholly ignorant, intemperate, and unrefined. It is only if he lets himself be guided, taught, and, if you will, controlled by his parents and tutors, that he reaches his full potential. Such is the case with your people. For you are as we were when our ancestors first came to Beleriand. Children in the sight of the... He is cut off as a messenger of Galadriel and Celeborn begs pardon for the interruption, but says that he wished to inform King Varix that he and his people are invited to stay with them during their time in Lindon. Valandil says all is well, for he has said all that needs to be said and must be going soon with his cousin to meet with the various peoples of Middle-earth. Go, my friend, he says to Varix. Remember what I have said, and your people shall prosper. If not in your lifetime, then those of your sons, and your sons' sons after them. Varix then goes to Galadriel and Celeborn, who are happy to see him, for he has proven himself an amiable acquaintance in their short time together. They continue to speak Sindarin, which for the purpose of the show can just be English depending on the context, and Galadriel mentions how he has done well to hide his apprehension, though not well enough to disguise it from the elves. Varix then speaks to his duties as a king, and how often he must humble himself in the sight of others for the sake of his people. Therefore, he says, I must ask that you teach my advisors and I how we may best live as a free and prosperous people on this Middle-earth. Celeborn smiles at the suggestion and graciously offers to take him and his entourage to Eregion, which is their own realm once they return. At the end of the episode, we see Elrond making some connection amidst the scrolls he has taken out when Gil-galad suddenly enters the room. High King, Elrond says, rising to pay the proper respects. Gil-galad bids him be seated and then asks him concerning the strands of evil which he spoke during the High Feast. Elrond says that he intended it as a metaphor for the corruption of the hearts which Morgoth wrought upon the world, and which persists to this day despite his downfall. Why do you ask? Gil-galad looks out towards the west across the sea. I fear it may be more than mere metaphor. How do you mean, High King? I have looked about these lands for many years, Elrond. Though I am not as wise or experienced as the Lady Galadriel or the Lord Celeborn, I still remember how the world felt when the sun and moon were young and before the great siege was broken. There is a change within the air. Subtle, but ever present. He then breaks off, and the two have silence for a moment. It seems that Gil-galad does not know what to say. After a few moments of silence, the two of them hear the harbor bells ringing in the distance. Elrond perks up and looks to the sea, while Gil-galad focuses on a small ship which is only just becoming visible in the morning light. An elf servant then informs the High King and his herald that it appears an envoy from Valinor is coming. Already, Gil-galad says in a muted voice, as the two of them begin to prepare for his arrival. The elves array themselves in as fine a manner as possible as the ship draws near. No elves are seen on the ship, and in fact, it seems to move on its own, powered by some otherworldly magic. And Galadriel comments on how it seems to shine with the grace and light to the two trees. Círdan attempts to guide the ship into the harbor, though by all appearances his help is not needed. The episode then ends with a great elf in shining armor stepping off the ship as the high elves bow in reverence to the Herald of Valinor. Varix and his people are awestruck by the mere sight of him, but we only get to see him from behind as he first steps foot upon the harbor. We begin by seeing the face of the envoy of Valinor. He has silver hair and bright eyes, and even seems to glow with a supernatural light. He steps forward and is greeted by Gil-galad, and the two begin to walk away. It's clear that the envoy is in some form of haste as he begins speaking with Gil-galad, who apologizes for the lack of preparation for his coming, and says that while they have only just now finished a feast, they would gladly prepare another for such an eminent guest. Furthermore, if I may be so bold, how shall I address my lord? Gil-galad says. The envoy states that he is to be called Elendil, for Manwë believed that the marvelous crafts of Ali alone would be sufficient for his mission. Even so, Gil-galad need not fret about preparation. He has urgent business of which he has only just enough time to briefly discuss with Gil-galad as it is. It is then that they come to the main courtyard. Elendil asks which path is the best route to the nearby Elvish realms, for he must deliver his message to them most of all. Gil-galad states that the southeast road through the great forests is likely the only one sufficient for any haste. Still, he adds, I would be much obliged if you could speak, however briefly, on your urgent business. What tidings from Valinor are so drastic as to require the Valar to send us an envoy? I hope that we have not done anything else to displease the great lords of the West. The envoy says that whether they have or have not, he was not told, for he has more important business than the issue of the Noldor staying in Middle-earth. Your world is fading, he says, a statement which Gil-galad and many of the elves around him are surprised to hear, until he looks down slightly, saying, I admit I've noticed the change myself. The world is indeed not as it once was. But Elendil contradicts such a modest statement. You do not understand, my friend. The world is not simply less than it was. It is fading. The corruption of Morgoth has seeped into the very heart of Arda itself. If something is not done to counteract this, even fair Linden will fade. He then points to the great tree at the center of the courtyard and calls everyone's attention to it. All the elves look and are horrified to see that several of the leaves have begun to wither, and the trunk and branches are less green than they were before. Varix and his entourage are watching this with little understanding, having no conception description of the significance of the tree and having little or no understanding of the Elvish being spoken. Elrond, who is standing nearby, notices this and begins to explain everything to them. He tells them about how the great tree is, in many ways, the heart of this land, its roots stretching far throughout the Blue Mountains and nourishing them. It is likewise the oldest and loveliest of the trees in Lindon, made in the image of Telperion himself, and cousin of Nimloth the Fair and Numenor. Therefore, the fact that even it is fading in the greatest of elven realms is cause for concern. Gil-galad moves to touch the tree, and we can see the sorrow on his face as he picks up one of the withering leaves. "So it has come to this," he says under his breath. "This is horrible," one of Varric's assistants says to his king. "I never could have imagined the elves would be fading. All the tales say they're immortal." "Still," Varric says, "they are willing to teach us what we need, and we shall be thankful to them for their knowledge. Who knows, perhaps that envoy will manage to save everyone." He then looks and finds that the envoy has disappeared. He looks around and sees that everyone else is still contemplating the tree. He therefore speaks up and points out that the envoy has left. Gil-galad turns from the tree and looks about, realizing that Varric is right. He is confused for a moment before merely shaking his head and declaring, "The envoy has indeed left. Well, let us hope that he fulfills his task." He looks out at the sun, which has risen over the horizon in the distance, over the misty mountains. We then transition from this shot to another elf looking towards the rising sun. He is getting off a ship in a far more southern-looking climate. He has golden hair and rich armor, and likewise seems to shine with a certain supernatural presence, except this shining is more subtle, hidden, and can only be seen if one looks perceptively at the screen. He walks off the ship, seemingly expecting no great welcome, but nonetheless drawing stares from almost everyone who sees him. Men are baffled by his presence, elves seem somewhat troubled, and Harfoots are in complete awe. Among them is a Harfoot girl who is particularly interested in this stranger, following him for a while with a group of friends, and we find out based on their conversation that her name is Marigold. Marigold watches as the elf walks confidently, but still somewhat confusedly through the town. Eventually he is stopped by a group of Sylvan elves, who ask him what he is doing and where he is going. He attempts to speak to them, and they have some trouble understanding each other at first. Eventually, the stranger figures out how to speak with them, and begins asking them how to reach the other realms of the High Elves. The Sylvan Elves explain that it is not their place to discuss these sorts of matters with strangers. Therefore, they must wait until their commander returns from scouting, which they say could take several months. Still, they agree to take him to their tower to the south of the town. The stranger graciously accepts, and Marigold, after being pulled away by her friends, reluctantly goes back to the Harfoot village nearby. We then get to see the joyful frivolity of the semi-settled Harfoots in their village, which is set up just outside the harbor town. We see the Harfoot children chasing each other, while the older Harfoots are dealing with business, both with each other and with some human merchants wandering about the village. Marigold overhears a group of Harfoots and storemen talking about the coming disasters, and pulls herself away from her path to listen. They're talking about the signs in recent days, the river flooding, that comet that appeared a fortnight ago, not to mention Mrs. Cassia, who is Marigold's grandmother, has had a horrible feeling about the lands to the east for some time now. "Indeed," the other Harfoot man says. "Whatever happens, you can always trust Cassia. I dare say we should have left these lands weeks ago. Go meet up with the stores to the north of there." He elbows the storeman next to him, and they all raise their glass as if to toast. "Well, you know me," the storeman says. "I'm always willing to help you guys move up with my cousins. But it seems wrong to entrust your comings and goings to weather and the joints of an old woman." Suddenly, the Harfoot men become silent before the oldest speaks up. "Pseudo, I'm going to forgive your ignorance this once, but don't ever speak so poorly about Mrs. Cassia's judgment again." Marigold smiles at this and stretches forward to get a better look at the men talking. But in doing so, one of the Harfoot men sees her and calls her out. "Hey, Marigold, what are you doing here?" "Oh, you know, I just heard you talking about Granny and wanted to make sure that none of you were bad-mouthing the best Harfoot family you'll ever find." The Harfoot man shakes his head. "Has anyone ever told you you eavesdrop too much, little girl?" "Little? I'm nearly come of age." "Nearly is one way of putting it. In either case, you shouldn't be listening to people you have no business listening to." "Well, if you didn't want anyone listening to you, you could have chosen a more private place. Go inside that building. That's where you get all your drinks anyway." "Ah," says one of the other men. "If your family's so great, why don't you spend more time with them?" "A wonderful idea," Marigold says, and does a mocking bow as she retreats towards the other side of the village, closest to the river. We see the Harfoot men shaking their heads as she leaves before returning to their conversation. Marigold goes to a group of her friends and family who are drinking at an open table as a couple of pigs are walking past. "Ah, Marigold," her mother Amber says. "Did you pick up the vegetables from the market?" Marigold puts a sack of potatoes and leeks onto the table. "Yep. And I found this really cool snake in the water." "Oh dear," says her father, Rondel. "Please tell me you didn't bring this one home." Marigold then pretends to be offended. "Of course not. How could you think I would do such a thing? Anyway, I saw this really awesome elf in shining armor in the town." Her parents look at each other and her mother says, "There are plenty of elves around here, dear. What made this one so special?" "He came from the sea, and he glowed." Suddenly, her father acquires a rather grave look on his face. "Do you think we'll be able to talk to him? He seemed really special." "We're going to have to tell your mother about this," Rondel says to Amber. "That's another bad omen. When the shinier elves start arriving, it means there's trouble brewing in the land." "Which reminds me," Amber says, "we need to go back to the house. The apples need picked and the flowers need watered." "Which reminds me," Marigold says, "that healer lady was asking about us again in the town, and I told her she could come around in a few hours before sundown." "Ah, good," Rondel says to Amber. "That woman has become your mother's favorite customer. I hope we'll have enough herbs for her." In the next scene, we are introduced to Bronwyn, a southern healer and tradeswoman who became a part of the town a decade or so ago. She's speaking with Cassia about all the herbs their family has available, and luckily she has been able to find most of them. "Wonderful. As always, your help is most appreciated. Let's see. Oh, it looks like I just have one more thing on my list. Do you have any sage?" Cassia frowns. "I'm afraid not. We used the rest of it a few days ago and haven't had the chance to gather more. However, we could grow some if you would like." "I'm afraid that won't work. I need quite a bit of it, and it'll have to be within a few weeks or so. Is there any way you can get it in that time?" "Of course. The other families wouldn't even know where to look, but my girls have a knack for finding these sorts of herbs. You come back in a week or so. I'll have my girls get enough for you." "Are you sure they won't mind?" "Mind? My dear, they absolutely love camping out in the field and forest gathering herbs. Ruby in particular enjoys clover and sage, much like myself when I was her age." She calls all the Harfoot children of her extended family together and tells them that Mrs. Bronwyn needs sage, and the family needs a short list of other herbs as well. "And you better be quick. I expect you all to be back within a week. Understand?" They all nod. "Good. Now who would like to go?" Marigold volunteers first, along with her sister Ruby, and they quickly get on their ponies and ride off into the forest east of the village. We then cut to a shot of Gilgalad approaching the great tree once more. The courtyard is empty and silent. There's a somber atmosphere over the whole thing as he sorrowfully touches the great trunk once again. He looks pensive, and after a few moments, Elrond steps into the courtyard. "You called, High King." "I did. I've been thinking on the words of this Elendil as well as your own and combining them with my own study. What the Envoy says is true. This world has been fading rather drastically for some time now. I do not wish to contradict you, High King, nor the wisdom of the Valar, but I have lived for many years with the sun as well, and have not detected so drastic a decline as this envoy seems to imply. If I may be so bold, it is often said that urgent business exaggerates one's perception. Would this not be merely another example of this? My dear Elrond, you have spent much time in the lands long blessed by the presence of the High Elves, and now you spend your days within Lindon, the greatest of elvish realms still on this Middle-earth. It is no wonder that the corruption which has spread throughout the world has not been felt as keenly here. He then turns to the tree again, and once more gently touches its trunk. A touch of sorrow washes over his face. Even so, Lindon will fade, Elrond. More slowly perhaps than the other realms, but she will fade. We have had far too little time in this Middle-earth. He then turns once more to Elrond and says, but even more than this, we must realize that other realms will feel this failing much more keenly and quickly than we will. We cannot look merely to our own good, Elrond. We must also help them as well. What do you propose we do, High King? I've decided to send you to Eregion with Galadriel and Celeborn when they leave. The envoy of Valinor spoke of how the arts of Alle may be our only hope, and the elven smiths of the Gwathi Meridain are now the greatest craftsmen outside of the West, in some ways surpassing even the great smiths of the Noldor and Beleriand. Go, and see if you can find a way to delay this corruption. I am afraid that it cannot be wholly stopped. But even 1,000 years more in this world would be a truly glorious thing. It will be done, High King. We see Galadriel, Celeborn, and Varix getting ready to leave as Elrond comes to them. Each has their own entourage, with Varix having gathered all of his people. We see that many of them have learned how to speak in basic Sindarin, and even some of their clothes are more richly woven after gaining the time and resources. Elrond and Varix exchange a few words of pleasantries, and Galadriel asks what Elrond's purpose is. Elrond notes that it would be a long explanation that would perhaps best wait for when they have reached Eregion for fear of burdening them with a second hearing. Celeborn Aragorn merely smiles and points out that they have a long road ahead of them, and he would not tire of hearing his friend's voice twice over. Finally, we see Marigold and several of her cousins gathering various herbs. We see that they've been doing this for a while, and there's some relaxing banter between the 6 of them. Ruby clearly looks up to her older sister, but is actively discouraged from following her too closely by the other girls. Marigold doesn't seem to mind, but does move away from the rest of them and enjoys a bit of peace and quiet among the trees. We hear her singing a walking song, but as she does this, she notices that there are no birds or other animals in the area, which she finds odd. She investigates further and finds a large amount of slashing and burning towards the eastern side of the forest. Immediately, she rushes back to the camp and tells everyone to leave, presenting evidence of orcs in the area. One of her cousins tells her that Ruby is missing, having gone to search for her, and so she goes up to a hill to look for her. She calls out a few times and is eventually able to find her, but in the meantime, she sees a large band of orcs heading directly to the town. We then cut back to the stranger, who is still sitting within the elf tower, reading various reports about the surrounding area, as well as looking over several maps. We see him like this only for a few moments, but it's clear that he has been doing this for some time, and it is also clear that he is greatly disturbed and troubled by what he reads. His thoughts are cut off, however, as an elf named Erendir comes into the room. The stranger bows briefly to him, though it's clear that he does this merely as a formality. "My lord, I thank you for the hospitality of your men, and I apologize for any further questions I must ask." "Lord?" "Yes, I suppose I am a lord after a fashion. My friends tell me you are a high elf from the sea. What would you have with us?" "Well, I am afraid I cannot disclose my task. My masters have commanded secrecy, in addition to urgency. If it is any comfort to you, I did not intend to come this way, and I have no quarrel with you or your people." "Indeed," Erendir says. "I should hope that you have no quarrel with us, for my people have done all we can to keep ourselves distant from the elves of the West. I know of no ill will my people bear towards you, but be that as it may, I am an envoy to the Elvish realms, and I must deliver a message with great urgency." "An envoy? By whom were you sent?" "That, I'm afraid, is something I cannot disclose, save to those to whom I bear the message." Erendir pauses as he looks at the stranger, while the stranger seems to likewise be examining him. We see a great difference in the shining light of the stranger's eyes compared to the relative darkness of Erendir's. And yet there is a spark of light, as if some hint of the elder days rested within him. "I see," Erendir says, "that you are from the West indeed. We have heard tales about the great works of our long-sundered brethren in Beleriand, but rarely do they come into our midst. We have had little time, as elves reckon it, to build a friendship with our distant cousins. But they have left us alone, and we have paid them the same courtesy. I, likewise, intend to leave you to your ways, for it is not my task to correct or even examine the customs and laws you have established within your own lands and among your own people. I only ask that you help me find passage to the elven kingdoms to the north." Erendir raises an eyebrow. "North, you say? Do you not know that a great forest sunders those lands from us? I have read it, and you intend to make the journey in any case? If I do not, many could die, and a great evil will certainly befall this Middle-earth." Erendir once more pauses as if to examine any hint of deception within his eyes, but eventually nods and leads him out of the tower. Just as they leave the tower, we see Marigold galloping as fast as her pony can carry her to the elves. "Orcs!" she screams. Erendir stops her and asks what she's talking about. "I saw orcs coming, Mr. Elf." Erendir ignores the strange address and asks with a hint of suspicion. "Very well. Where are they?" "They were in the forest. They're in this huge pack." "I don't need those details, Marigold. I just need to know where they're going." "That's what I'm trying to tell you. They're coming towards the town." "They're coming here?" Erendir pauses. Then he wakes into action, commanding the lord of the town to rally the guard together. He calls his own soldiers, and then he demands exact reports of the orc movements from his scouts. He points to the nearby hills outside the town and the woods as their points of defense, but points to the tower as the fallback point for the elves. After he has given these orders, he approaches the stranger. "If it please you, my lord, I would have your help in this battle. My aid is yours to command, my friend, and it seems we may yet have more to discuss once the battle is won." It is then that they hear the horns of the orcs, and see smoke rising from the hills from which Erendir had pointed only just before. We then see the orcs descend from them, and Erendir looks around to see another, smaller orc band approaching from the forest to attack the town. Confusion flashes across his face before he looks around and calls to 3 of his elvish commanders. "Estion, Lendor, take the scouts and assist the humans holding off the smaller orc raid. If you can, defeat them in the field and direct the tower guard over to the main battle here. Maethor, take some of your archers and defend the tower. Send all other soldiers and guards out to meet the orcs on that hill. They cannot pass it without becoming surrounded, so they will be forced to engage. With any luck, the men will deal with the smaller force easily and be able to assist us." "Mr. Elf," Marigold yells. What? Our archers will be able to help you as well. I sent for them as soon as I saw the orcs. Arendir smiles. It seems that you have not lost your quality of being helpful when need demands it. Thank you? Arendir begins to rally his forces together, and the stranger draws his sword, looking towards the main hill to the east. Distant though it is, we watch him as he sees a figure cloaked in black, standing upon a black horse amidst a group of similarly dressed men. They seem to be watching the orc and elf movements intently, though contributing nothing to either side. The stranger then joins the rest of the elves. The orcs from the forest reach the town first, and would have begun slaughtering the townsmen had the elvish scouts not arrived in time. The elf, named Estion, in particular, shows his abilities to guide each of the households into the walls quickly, while also getting the town guards and lord's soldiers arrayed, while Lendor uses his group of elves to pick off and confuse many of the orcs before they even reach the town. The town guard, having already been alerted, begins its defense of the wall, and it becomes clear rather quickly that the orcs are no match for a prepared defense, and they begin looting and burning the town outside the walls. One of the local nobles rallies together a section of the wall and charges out to meet them. A skirmish begins where said nobleman becomes injured. It is then that we see that Bronwyn is on the battlefield, conducting a small safe area near the walls and healing all the men she can. Thank you, my lady, the nobleman says. Bronwyn smiles at his courtesy and slightly bows her head as she begins to treat his leg, which has the largest wound. I've sworn to preserve the lives of those I could. I consider it my honor to do what I can for you. The main battle, however, is on the hill, where the elves and Harfoots, as well as a few other men, have had barely enough time to reach the hill before the orcs are on them. The orc army isn't massive, likely numbering no more than several hundred, but the elves are so few in number that it proves difficult. We see Arendir's skill particularly as a commander, directing the elves and Harfoots towards focusing on major targets and tactical maneuvers. We also see that he is a skilled fighter, taking out several orcs in a Legolas-style scene. When we see the stranger fighting, however, we see that he is in a league all to himself. He cuts his way through dozens of orcs throughout the fight, and the longer he fights, the more he seems to glow with a white light. Hidden as if behind a thin veil, the fury of his gaze casts all the orcs into a frightful dread of him. Within minutes of fighting, the orcs realize their numbers have starkly dwindled, and as the stranger continues to cower them with mere looks, to them it appears as though one of the rumored gods of the West have come to Middle-earth seeking vengeance upon them, though to the eyes of the others it merely appears that he is an exceptional fighter. The orcs begin to rout, and as they do, the elves charge towards them, the stranger leading the charge, and what will to remain in the fight amongst the orcs breaks. A few horsemen chase after them, killing as many as they can before reaching the forest, while the stranger looks towards the hill. The cloaked figure, casting a certain dread upon the town, seems to stare intently at him. Arendir notices this as well. That orc chieftain does not look pleased with the result of the battle. The stranger watches the cloaked figure, and for a moment we merely see the two of them facing each other over the great distance. But before long, the figure and those around him turn and disappear behind the hill. That is no orc chieftain, I'm afraid. It's something else entirely. We start the episode with the aftermath of the battle from last episode. Arendir is going about checking the wounded, and it is here that he first meets Bronwyn, who is still taking care of the nobleman whom she saved last episode during the battle. We find out that his name is Gath, while Arendir asks Bronwyn why she endangered herself during an orc raid. She states simply that those who cannot fight may still have much to add to a battle. Arendir considers this for a moment, noting that in his experience those who cannot fight will often hinder a battle effort as much as help it. Bronwyn stands from her work and says simply that she has hindered no battle effort in her time as a healer in the field, and she doubts that will begin anytime soon. Gath speaks in her defense as well, saying that if anything, she has saved at least 20 men in the past day, and he doubts whether their battle was made any worse by her presence. Arendir then nods, saying he may have to consider such an asset in the future. Arendir and the stranger then meet and begin to discuss the battle. Arendir mentions how the orcs have been coming down from Ethel Duath more frequently recently, but they would usually only attack the outer villages, which is where most of his elves are stationed. The stranger does not say much throughout this conversation, as he is deep in thought, but he does ask Arendir a few questions about the general movements of the orcs. Arendir notes that they have been largely repelled for several years now this far west. However, he notices the troubled look on his acquaintance's face and realizes what he's thinking. You believe they know of your errand? It is possible, the stranger says. And if this is the first time they've been so bold, they may very well have come specifically for me. Arendir's face becomes incredibly serious, akin to Ishmael's acting face. What, then, do you propose? If my guess is true, then I must leave immediately. Are you sure that there is no direct route north? North? Marigold says as she walks over to the two elves. Well, if he's going north, then there's no problem, Mr. Commander. I'll be able to get the pretty elf there in no time. Both Arendir and the stranger look at Marigold with a mixture of confusion and amusement, though Arendir's is swiftly replaced by exasperation. Marigold, please don't speak to my guests that way. Think nothing of it, my friend, the stranger says to Arendir. He then turns to Marigold. I am thankful for your offer, little one, but even from what little I have gathered in my time here, there are dangers in the way where I must go, and it seems as though something is not quite right about all of this. But I was the one who warned you people about the orc attack in the first place. You'd be dead if it weren't for me and my cousins. The stranger chuckles as he turns to Arendir. She has a point, you know, which causes Arendir to frown and roll his eyes, going to check on his soldiers. The stranger continues, You have a stout heart, little one, but I am afraid I cannot take you north with me. If something should befall you, then I shall count myself responsible. You just don't get it, do ya? Us Harfoots are going that way as well, so you can come with us. That orc attack was the straw that broke the carriage floor, and Granny says it's time to go at this point, and I can't help but agree with her. Which reminds me, Arendir, she shouts in the commander's direction. Granny says you should probably get going as well, and I'd listen to her if I were you. She hasn't been around forever like you elves, but she sees things, you know? Arendir raises an eyebrow as he reapproaches. She told you to give me this advice? Yep. Arendir pauses for a moment before surprisingly nodding. Then I will take her advice. He then once more excuses himself, leaving Marigold and the stranger there alone. Well, she demands of him. The stranger sighs. Very well. I suppose if you are going the same way, it will not hurt if I accompany you. Though he begins to frown as he says this. We then cut to Elrond talking to Celeborn, Galadriel, and Varix about the gradual corruption of the world. Galadriel remains silent throughout the conversation, subtly watching Varix, who frequently looks to the misty mountains looming in the east. Celeborn speaks most throughout the conversation, mentioning that he is honored by the fact that both the Herald of Valinor as well as Gil-galad believe those skilled in the crafts of Allay will know best how to deal with this corruption, which he admits was something he had begun to notice as well. The two begin discussing the crafts of the elven smiths at Eregion, and Celeborn mentions in passing how they have begun the forging of rings, scepters, crowns, and swords of lesser quality than those of Gondolin or Nargothrond in Beleriand, but still of great power nonetheless. Galadriel and Varix are both looking towards the mountains, though it appears to be for different reasons, as Varix frowns while Galadriel smiles. It is then that Galadriel recommends that they turn east from there and meet their friends in Moria. Celeborn frowns at the idea, but acquiesces, and the group turns towards the mountains. As they approach, we get a sense of the scale of both Eregion and the Misty Mountains, with elvish towns seen in the distance and the beginnings of roads connecting the various parts of the realm, all while the mountains stretch high into the clouds, growing larger with each shot until the mountain wall soars to their left along the path. They then approach a group of about 5 elves and 12 dwarves, all working on a great door going right into the mountain. It is here that we are at last introduced to Celebrimbor, who is a young and virile-looking elven smith, much younger looking than both Galadriel and Celeborn, though slightly more aged than Elrond. He is diligently using a strange device to write a message of greeting upon the dwarvish door, while a dwarf next to him is doing much the same in runes. Before they can finish, however, they are interrupted by the announcement of Galadriel and Celeborn's arrival. The dwarf, looking with Celebrimbor, immediately departs from his work and is the first to greet the visitors, introducing himself as the dwarvish prince Narvi, a great friend of Celebrimbor and of Eregion. Galadriel smiles and thanks Narvi for his courtesy, as Celebrimbor arrives and greets his king and queen. The dwarves likewise show their thanks and admiration for the great realm of Eregion and its leaders, before Celebrimbor mentions that they will have to end their work for the day. Varix notes how impressed he is with the doorway, stepping forward to examine it and realizing that the inscription in form of the doorway is made with a metal. Narvi is filled with pride as he explains that the inscription is made with mithril, the true glory of Khazad-dûm. Celebrimbor mentions how the metal is the true cause of the mutual success of their realms, drawing out a single ingot of it and extolling its qualities. Varix steps back from the door and says that he has never seen any work quite like it, prompting the dwarves to say that it is almost finished, and a great beauty it will be when it is. Celebrimbor agrees, saying that he and his friends will soon experience the bane of all craftsmen in seeing their work finished, while also suffering the displeasure of knowing that they shall never work on on it again. Narvi comforts him by saying that they will, no doubt, find a new great work to occupy them when it is finished, and Celebrimbor agrees. The two then say Namarie to each other. The elves and men with Varix return to the road while Celebrimbor speaks with Galadriel and Celeborn, with Celeborn praising Celebrimbor for his dealing with the dwarves and the procuring of mithril. Indeed, Celebrimbor says, there's been much fruit from this friendship of elves and dwarves, but if you'll forgive so presumptuous a question, my king, I believe I felt a coldness in your courtesy towards the dwarves. Have my friends done anything to offend you? They've done nothing, Celebrimbor, Galadriel interjects. My husband's coldness is no fault of theirs. Celeborn sighs. She is right, my dear smith. Your friends have done me no wrong. My apologies, Lord. I should not have assumed any offense from your expression. I did not say that either. Celeborn shakes his head. You must understand, I bear no ill will towards our friends in Khazad-dûm, but the rune of Doriath will always be fresh in my mind when I look upon their kind. Celeborn bows his head, remembering the event, while Galadriel's face looks pained, though whether this is due to sympathy for her husband or agitation that he has not let the sins of the past die is hard to discern. In either case, they make their way towards a large city, which we can even learn by on-screen text is Ostendethil. In our next shot, we see the stranger and Marigold returning to the Harfoot village, which is now in a complete state of packing in preparation for the migration north. Marigold runs to her family and introduces the stranger. Hey Mom, Dad, Ruby, this is the shiny elf I was telling you all about. Rondell looks at the stranger with an expression that can only be described as confused admiration, whereas Ruby looks at the golden-haired elf with the dumbfounded wonder a child has when seeing a sky full of stars. He is shiny, she says. Rondell gets a hold of himself and apologizes to the stranger for his stupefaction. It's clear that the stranger doesn't understand the words, but understands the meaning nonetheless, and bows his head slightly in recognition. Marigold speaks to him in Elvish and introduces her father and sister and mentions that her mother's name is Amber. Now that I think of it, I'm not sure I've ever asked you your name, and Mr. Arendir didn't tell me about it either. You're pretty secretive for an elf, you know. Who am I kidding? All you elves are secretive. They say that if you ask an elf a question, they'll spend their entire time talking around it without getting you one step closer to what you wanted to know in the first place. Do they? The stranger laughed. Well, I would say that the elves are wise to keep secrets, especially from those who could be hurt by the truths they hide. Well, Granny always told me that lying is a bad thing. It's really hard to trust a liar. Indeed, but I doubt most elves you have met have ever told you something untrue. But we are by nature cunning with our words, for they are a gift, not one to be used lightly. I only understood half of that. But anyway, what can I call you? Saying Mr. Pretty Elf will get old real fast. I couldn't agree more, the stranger says, attempting to speak with smaller words. I suppose if I am already entrusting my mission to you, it will not hurt to entrust my name as well. You may call me Glorfindel while our friendship lasts. We then cut to Arendir, who is back in the tower, as a group of decently dressed men with scribes and guards approach the building. The elves greet them and welcome them inside. Arendir announces what his scouts have been reporting for many months now. The orcs are gathering towards the east and have been for some time. Their raids display the confidence that any of the elves in the area have yet to see from individual hunting bands. These last ones even had the audacity to attack the city directly while a battle raged. Are we not sure that this is merely an unfortunate coincidence? Asks one of the noblemen. Called Son of Hote, Gath says. I am afraid this is impossible. The orcs went past the eastern river and launched a coordinated attack. They meant to catch these elves out of position while we were kept inside the town. It is unreasonable to believe this was anything other than a plan by a higher mind. Arendir nods. The orcs have a leader. No doubt with enough investigation I can discover who and what that leader is. Indeed, he did not seem shy showing himself during the battle, though he has disappeared since then. Clearly, he finds you easy to evade, one of the noblemen remarks. Arendir's face shows no acknowledgement to the insult. If you would like to send scouts of your own, then by all means do so. Make no mistake, I wish to have this thing found and executed for the danger it poses to us. What are we waiting for, Cult says. Let us gather the search parties and begin to move east. I'm afraid that's also not an option, Gath says. Shortly after the battle, we learn that there was a third orcish party which has gone about and burned our fields. My lands will have no harvest this year, and as of yet, we've been unable to track down that group of orcs. They were last spotted crossing the river and looked to be moving north. This is outrageous, one of the noblemen from earlier remarks. Why do we trust you elves to protect us if you can't even perform your basic functions? I will remind you, my friend, Arendir says, that we are under no obligation position to defend you from anything. I and my brethren are here to support you and your people, especially amidst all the turmoils of the world. But we are few in number and must give mind to other issues which plague these lands. Very well, Cal says. But what are we going to do in this case? At this rate, there won't be any food left by spring. We have enough supplies for a long journey, my friends, Gath says, but those will dry up if we have to suffer many more of these orcish raids. That is why, Arendir says, I propose a twofold solution. There is a settlement of the Westmen north of here called Pelargir. Many of your people may be able to reside there. The rest will have to journey further up the river to the mountains we call Eminarnen. There is a sizable fortress there which will easily serve as a fortified holding from which we can maintain control of the river in conjunction with these Westmen. From there we can plan on how best to move forward. After a few moments of consideration, most of the noblemen agree to the plan, though one of them, who is lord over many of the farmers along the river, suggests that he and his people move further west. The others agree to this concession, and they begin preparations for moving out of the town. By night, it seems that everyone is ready to leave, and as they exit the town, the camera pans up and begins to move over the mountains of Efelduath, and we gradually see gathering tribes of orcs and men, though still largely separated. And we see the beginnings of a great black tower being constructed towards the north of a large mountain. We pan in towards the tower and see that there is something of a throne room with many dark, ominous, and black-cloaked men surrounding a single man kneeling before a throne. So you failed to catch him, a voice coming from the throne says. Lord Father, you gave me but 2 small tribes of those orc weaklings. You cannot expect me to resolve this issue without something more substantial. Do not insult my orcs, Khamul. The camera begins to look away from Khamul and looks towards the throne, and there we see what appears to be a man playing with a knife on the table. What you mean to say is that you let my plan be spoiled by a small group of men and elves. I even heard that you let the halfling archers tear my orcs to pieces. Khamul cringes at the mention of the halflings. Ah, yes, I know all about that. Did you not think that I would at least watch you on this mission? That elf could very well jeopardize our master's plans, and you failed to stop him. Perhaps I should entrust this task to someone else more suitable. Enough, Khamul shouts as he stands up. You may be the head of this council, but you are not my master. I will kill this elf and you will know your place in the new world. He then storms out of the room with several human guards who are clearly loyal to him in particular. The elf on the throne slams his knife into the arm of the chair and stands. Very well, Khamul. I'll let you play your game with your forces, but I will be the one who finishes the true task. And as he says this, he looks towards the mountain to the south. We then cut to Celebrimbor leading the rest of the elves and men into Ostendethil, and excusing himself to return to the Gwaithir Meridain, while Galadriel, Celeborn, Elrond, and Varix go to the palace. There they find Celebrian, who has been managing the kingdom in the absence of her father and mother. Elrond is seen watching Celebrian before she notices. He gets a hold of himself and bows courteously, thanking Celeborn and Galadriel for their company and asking permission to speak with the guilds of their realm. Galadriel graciously grants it, leading him to the Gwaithir Meridain. Meanwhile, Celeborn goes with Celebrian to spend some time with her and to discuss what has happened since their departure. After talking about some of the daily concerns which had been brought to her, Celeborn notices that she seems to be disguising something and begins questioning her to discover what she's hiding. Varix is shown to his rooms and is told by Galadriel that they will begin lessons for his people within a few weeks. In our next scene, we get an overview of the men, elves, and Harfoots departing from their towns and beginning to move up the Anduin. It becomes clear that the Harfoots are much more prepared for leaving and settling in other places, but many, including Marigold, are still sad to leave. With a short montage, we see them moving up the Anduin, with the implication that several days or even weeks have passed until the elves and men make their way into the fortress, while the Harfoots and Glorfindel continue up the Anduin. Many of the farmers and workers begin to occupy the surrounding lands, believing this to be their new home, while the soldiers immediately search the fortress to discover its secrets. They find a few tunnels which they block off or fill, and begin mending some of the defenses, especially the outer walls, all while food and other supplies begin to stockpile. Arendir is watching and directing the entire operation with a look of thoughtful worry when one of his scouts approaches him, telling him that they have found the armory. They go and find a building within the inner walls, which is filled to bursting with armors and weapons weapons of various types and sizes. Among the various weapons is a black sword with an onyx stone set within the hilt so large that it bulges out of both sides. Arendir looks upon the weapon with horror. This device has seen to the death of many. What is it? Estior asks. Arendir raises his hand towards the sword but recoils as it nears the blade. He looks down and turns to Estior, his horror still constant, and says, You have lived no more than 30 years in these Southlands. What do you know about them? I know the trees and hills as well as any elf, sir, and I know the names of the men in these lands by heart. And what of before we elves came to assist the men of this region? Of that I know little. Arendir nods, and you are likely better for it. For I have been in this land for nearly 1,000 years, before any great host of elves came over the mountains and settled in the forest to the north. I have seen petty kingdoms rise and fall, tribes of men from every land squabbling for power. Among them was a dark tribe, whose name even I know not. They were small and weak as far as tribes go, but they had no qualms with seeking power from darker elements. They consigned themselves to dark spirits with whom it is said not even the great enemy himself would parley. From them they gained knowledge of how to forge weapons of dread, which would cause the earth to quake, storms to gather, and mountains to burst. Estior shudders at this news, but Arendir continues. What's worse, these weapons exacted a heavy price for their use. Power must come from somewhere, and if it be not in the knowledge or skill of the wielder, as is often the case with such dark arts, it must be drawn from life itself. Estior's eyes widen. You don't mean, Arendir nods. That is the purpose of this blade. Arendir shakes his head and once more turns towards the sword. We must lock it up and keep it secret, for I dread to imagine the horrors that could be revived in this land if it fell into the wrong hands. In our next scene, Galadriel and Elrond are going to the Gwathi Meridain after having formulated a plan for experimenting with arts, which will hopefully reduce the decay of the earth. They enter, and we see in a panning shot the brilliance of the elven crafts which have been stockpiled and stored in the guild. Eventually the camera rests on Celebrimbor, who is at work amongst his fellow smiths and is concentrating greatly on some fine plan. Galadriel calls to him, which snaps him out of his trance, and he presents himself to the two of them with a bow. My lord Elrond and my lady Galadriel, what can I do for you? It is clear from his voice that he is brimming over with excitement, though certainly not from the presence of his guests. Celebrimbor, Galadriel says, I'm afraid we did not have the chance to speak about this while we were on the road, but our dear friend Elrond bears a message from the High King. Message? Indeed, Elrond says, I am afraid that I have ill news which we must discuss at length. For the beauty and life of the world has begun to fade. Celebrimbor has no response, as if he were expecting some other comment from Elrond to punctuate his declaration. Seeing this, Elrond continues. The High King, knowing that the greatest elven smiths of the Noldor may be able to alleviate this decay, has requested your aid in the creation of new devices to preserve the beauty of the world. As he goes on with the proposal, Galadriel notices that Celebrimbor is becoming bored and even impatient. I would have thought, she says, that you would be honored to receive such an offer from the High King. Horror at the realization that he has been disrespectful flashes across Celebrimbor's face, and he profusely apologizes to Elrond for his inattentiveness. Please, forgive me, my lord Elrond. I did not wish to offend. It is only that I have already received such news that we have already been at work to alleviate these problems for several days now. Indeed, Galadriel says. Tell me, who gave you this news and this commission? Would you like to meet him, my lady? He is working among us at this moment. Celebrimbor then leads the three of them to one of the forges, where we see Elendil, the messenger of the Valar, overseeing one of the projects wherein a lesser ring of power is being forged. And for our final scene, we have Arendir looking over the layout of the fortress, the surrounding lands, and the reports from scouts. His thoughts are interrupted by a messenger who says that a small band of orcs with an elf at their head is coming to the fortress. Arendir grabs his gear and gathers a few of his guards, while some of the lords of the men who also occupy the forest join him as they go to the main gate of the fortress to meet this strange group. When they arrive, they find that it was just as the scout described. An elf with about 7 orcs, all of whom have swords, maces, or daggers, have approached the gate bearing a token of negotiation. Who are you, and what is it you want from us? Arendir says. I am called Adar, the elf says, and these are my friends. The orcs chuckle at the comment. Elves have no friendship with the corrupted race, Arendir says. Oh, I disagree. We shall all have to be friends eventually, and I assure you these fine lads mean you no harm. Again, the orcs laugh at the comment. What is your business here? Lord Gath demands of them. Only this, that these lands, and this fortress in particular, belong to me and mine, and you are therefore trespassing upon it. I bid you leave these lands and return any devices you may have uncovered here, and I will leave you at liberty to go to whatever land will take you. If this is meant to be your fortress, I'd like to know why it was abandoned before we arrived, says Lord Kalt. Peace, Arendir says. What if we do not comply? Oh, that's simple, Adar replies. If you do not leave this fortress within a fortnight, I shall just simply assault it with my whole host of orcs. Once we break through, we will be sure to kill all of you for your impudence. As I'm sure you know, my friends have no qualms about the slaughter of women and children. What proof do you have, says Lord Kath, that your force will be strong enough to break through this fortress? Adar smiles and says, a wonderful question indeed. I suppose we shall have to find out whether it can. But remember, you are the ones bargaining with the lives of your people. With that, he turns and goes back into the forest. The camera begins to zoom in on Arendir, whose hard face masks the worry he is feeling. Lord Gath shakes his head and sighs with exasperation, commenting on how removing themselves from this land already may be too much for their people to take. Sir, what would you have us do? Arendir closes his eyes before turning to look at the others. Prepare for a siege. Our episode opens with a short montage of the Harfoot stores in Glorfindel heading north on the Anduin. We see a mixture of walking, eating, and rowing up the river as the landscape gradually changes from late summer to fall. If you want, we can even have some singing like what was in the show, but a decent amount of time should be shown to have passed considering just how many people there are, the general lack of urgency, the fact that they're all moving uphill, and by the passing of the seasons. We see Marigold and Glorfindel talking throughout the montage, and gradually Marigold's family begins to warm to him. Glorfindel rather quickly learns to navigate through Harfoot family politics, though he finds himself annoyed that he seems to be a pawn in the larger game that they're playing. He does, however, remark to himself that he is lucky that the most prestigious family is the one guiding him. Furthermore, we see him asking for greater amounts of haste, which eventually the Harfoots acquiesce to, and we see that within a day of picking up their pace, they make it to the Falls of Raros. At first, the Harfoots want to go around, but Glorfindel says that this is likely a bad idea. The stores then note that there's a way you can get up the falls on either side of the river, and Glorfindel casts his vote on this idea. The scene then ends when we see Hamul and his followers watching the Harfoots, with a large group of wargs following behind. We then cut to Valinor and Silmo, the Numenorean men we met in episode 1, returning to their ship after having docked and spoken with the leader of a Numenorean colony in Middle-earth. They are both clearly happy with the way things have been kept up in the city, and the audience can see that the city looks rather impressive, especially in comparison to the small town and tower we saw in Arendir's plot. That was well done, says Valinor as they board the ship. I'd say your sister would be proud were it not for her impossible expectations. Isilmo smiles. Queenship over Numenor is a difficult task, especially without a husband. I would say you should be thankful for her expectations, as they're the reason you're on this expedition. Valinor laughs. True. Ah well, I suppose that does invalidate my complaints, even if it does make the journey last longer. After they finish boarding, they find Minister, the son of Isilmo, waiting to hand over command. The ship has been prepared to set sail, he says formally and in an overly stiff manner. Well done, lad, Valinor says as he claps his hand on his shoulder. But loosen up. People are just as likely to take offense if you're overly stiff as if you're overly relaxed. Depending on who is presented to you, they might perceive you as being angry or harsh with them. Minister nods and relaxes his shoulder. In either case, we're ready to set sail. Good, Isilmo says. Captain, release anchor and let us move on to the next colony. Yes, sir, the captain says. Actually, Minister says as he grabs hold of his father's arm, I was wondering if now would be a good time to return to Numenor. Is that so? I thought you would have shown excitement for this next phase of the journey. It is, after all. Finally your turn to cast judgments and to make treaties with the peoples of Middle-earth. I believe I have gained enough of an understanding from watching the two of you. Isilmo raises an eyebrow at this. In either case, I'm afraid that's not an option. The Queen wants to make contact with each of the colonies, as well as each trade partner. Numenorean presence has not been felt on Middle-earth for far too long. We must remind the people that we are still at large, that we are still quite powerful. I'm sure Telperion will understand. After all, you yourself noted that if we were gone for too long from our side, then plots may very well begin to form. That's Telperion to you, Minister. And while we have to be cautious about being errant for too long, there are also dangers for returning too quickly, especially without completing all of our work. Minister's back straightens at the rebuke, light though it was. Father, you know I only have the best interests of Numenor in our house in mind. I never doubted it, Silmo says, but part of your training is knowing when to accept the wisdom of others and when to exercise it yourself. You will likely be king one day if my sister remains stubborn and refusing to marry, but for now, you must accept my and your uncle's decisions in these matters. Minister bows his head slightly as Asilmo walks away before looking out to the west towards the setting sun. We then see the Southlanders and elves preparing for a siege. Arendir specifically notes how they should be as quick as possible, for we do not know if he will hold true to his promise of 14 days, with the other elves agreeing, knowing that it wasn't even truly a promise in the first place. My lord Arendir, Lord Gath says, there's something I must speak with you about. By all means, say your piece. If I could, I would have it be in private. From my own soldiers, even? I am afraid so, my lord, meaning no offense to the integrity of your fellows. None has been received, my lord, one of the scouts says. Indeed, I and my group were just about to set out on our next scouting mission. Indeed, Arendir says. In fact, pay special attention to the off-road areas. It may be that the orcs have planned some ambushes for our parties. Arendir and Gath retreat to an inner chamber within the citadel, and it's clear that Gath is not fully recovered from his injury and from the journey. Will you be all right, my lord? Oh, I'll be fine, but I likely won't be able to participate in the battle should it come before the allotted time. I'm sure that you will provide much value, commanding men from within the walls. I thank you, my friend, but in any case, I've had a rather disturbing realization which I simply had to share privately for reasons I hope will become clear. Has it occurred to you how odd it is that this fortress, after having been abandoned for decades, if not hundreds of years, would be demanded by the orcs no more than a month after we have occupied it? The timing did seem odd, I admit, but given the ferocity of the orcs in their more recent battles with us, I had assumed it was due to their discovering we had occupied it. The orcs have been particularly keen on seeing your people dead, and they consider this to be the easiest and fastest way to accomplish this. Indeed, but did you not hear what the elf said? Adar, I think he called himself. Did you not hear what he offered? He asked us not to turn in ourselves, but merely to abandon this fortress. He even offered us liberty to settle elsewhere if we leave. A lie, no doubt. Perhaps, but what caught my attention the most was his request that we leave behind any devices which we have found. What do you suppose that could mean? Arendir sits back in his seat, his face unreadable. Go on. I think some of our men have discovered a weapon or mechanism in this fortress and have delivered this information to the orcs. That is why they came to this fortress so quickly without us detecting any of their scouts or raiding parties even being this far north. We have a spy in our midst. Arendir turns away from Gath's eyes as he processes this information before nodding as everything begins to fall into place. That would make the most sense of this situation, and even if it is not quite true, we have good reason to suspect many of our men. Do you have any ideas of who the spy could be? It would surely be someone who found whatever device they're looking for. Arendir nods. Very well. In any case, I'm not certain we will be able to discover the traitor before the siege begins. Let's focus on preparations for now. A worthy decision, my lord. We then return to the Numenoreans. Isilmo is judging a case between two craftsmen over whether a given sword was stolen from a blacksmith. Valandil and Minister watch from the side, with Valandil telling him to pay attention to the arguments that they're using. Specifically, he notes that the accuser believes that, since the Numenoreans are not a constant presence in their cities, they're ignorant of what is actually going on. The case is unexpectedly decided in favor of the defendant. The next case comes between a merchant and a farmer. My lords, the merchant says, I am the head of the Yunmal family. No doubt you have heard of us. I have, Isilmo says. What complaint would you like to bring? I'm afraid that I have a dispute concerning the land owed to me by this young man. Isilmo looks at the two men and then to his son and says, I am afraid I'm not well versed in your laws of land rights. Surely a Numenorean lord such as yourself is learned enough to judge justly in any situation. Isilmo smiles. Indeed. Very well, if you will hear a judgment, then I would like my son to be the arbiter, for he has long studied matters such as this. The merchant's smiling facade slips for a moment, but he bows nonetheless, and Minister comes to the judgment seat, disguising his surprise. He hears the case, and specifically notices that the merchant is making a rather ostentatious showing of his knowledge of the legal technicalities of the situation, which, for the purpose of the actual production, need not be well thought out, at least not in terms of in-depth, real legal parallels or anything along those lines. Ultimately, when the farmer is finally allowed to speak, he merely states that the lands which are under dispute have been his and his family's for generations, and that at no point in their history had they ever agreed to give this merchant his land. You have been failing in upholding your contracts for 2 years, the merchant says. Which contracts are those? Minister asks. May I see them? The merchant pauses, as if he were not expecting such a request, but manages to produce the contracts rather quickly. Minister likewise quickly reads through them. There's nothing in these contracts which speaks about turning over land. Ah, but he promised to provide wool for the last 4 years and has largely ignored his end of the deal, though I have remained faithful in providing the money. Turning to the farmer, Minister says, Is this true? My wool sheep were stolen, my lord. I can't provide the wool, and he pulls out another contract. I asked for a new deal so that he would stop sending me the money, but he refused. Your contract does not follow legal procedure. Besides, the custom of this land is that those who refuse the fulfillment of a deal pay an equal value. My friend here has just admitted that he has not the money to return, nor the wool for the fulfillment of the contract. There is, however, something he owns which is of equal value. I'll admit it's been an especially hard set of years, and I'm usually not so poor as many others, I know, so we thought we could fulfill our end of the deal, but my family and friends need that land just as much as previous years. I'll admit I'm not good with the signatures, my lord, but I promise to repay him anything he's owed when I have the means. And when will that be, the merchant says. Shall it be 20 years when I get my returns? What need have you or your family for this payment? Minister asks. The merchant looks at Minister as if he did not understand the question. What do you mean, my lord? Are you likely to starve if this man does not repay you? No, but I don't see why that should matter, given. And you, young man, why have you not returned the money you were given? Well, he didn't give me much money, my lord. He then looks at the merchant and says, In fact, my lord, the merchant says, this public courtroom is clearly too rife with interruptions. Perhaps we could deal with this more privately. He subtly reveals a few pieces of gold in his hand, and the farmer, seeing this, has fear in his eyes, as if he's been in this sort of situation before. Minister's eyes narrow. You plan on bribing me, expecting the rest of the room to go into an uproar. But to his surprise, there are only a few murmurs that pass throughout the room, and everyone remains fairly uninterested in the action. Seeing this, Minister shakes his head. Enough of this. I will pay whatever is missing in the man's settlement if you will agree to pester him no longer. But, my lord, no. I will not tolerate your bending of the law to contravene justice. You will accept my settlement, or you will get nothing. The merchant's face finally darkens as his facade slips, and he pauses to glare at Minister. As my lord wishes. We then cut to them outside, with Valinor congratulating Minister on his first successful judgment. Isilmo makes no comment, but he's clearly pleased as well. Minister realizes quickly that the city is not what they've come to expect from a Numenorean port, commenting that it isn't much more than a town with a somewhat larger marketplace. Isilmo then explains the predicament of men in Middle-earth, how they are not as well off as the Numenoreans. We see the people make way for them as they pass, and they continue to walk through the market. But as they go, we see a mysterious figure, or group of mysterious figures following them. They approach a lookout over the coast, and Minister contemplates how well the elves lived compared to these men, and he asks if there's anything they could do to help them. Valinor says it's possible, and that this is one of the purposes of these agreements. Isilmo is less optimistic, saying that they can do much to support these men, but they cannot force them to change their ways, some of which are likely keeping them down. Minister begins to have a sort of sea longing and asks once more that they return to Numenor. But this is shot down by Isilmo once more for the same reason as before. It is after this that they descend from the lookout and they are attacked soon after. The attackers are clearly attempting to kill Minister in particular, but they are repulsed, though one of them is captured and questioned. Who are you? Valinor demands, twisting the man's arm. What is your purpose in attacking my nephew? Why should I tell you? He cries out in pain. Okay, fine. We were hired to kill the young Numenorean after he ruined our clients' livelihoods. What? Minister says. Indeed, Valinor says. Abrazan, take this man to the master of the city and explain the situation. Furthermore, let him know that the Yunmal family may have much to answer for. The Numenorean guardsman does as requested. Minister, however, still standing aghast while he watches the man move away, says, I thought I acted according to justice. I thought the case was clear. You did. And it was, Valinor says. Then why would they try to kill me? Because justice does not always favor all men, especially those who desire their own advancement. You do well to give others what is their due, but this results in punishing the evildoer as much as rewarding the lawful. But when you do so, do not expect a man who is willing to rob a widow of her wealth to congratulate you when you force him to give it back. Minister nods, but is still quite shaken by the encounter. As encouragement, therefore, Valinor lays something in his hand and begins to walk away. What's this? Minister asks. A gift. The farmer gave it to me, but I have a feeling it was intended for you. Minister opens his hand to see an amulet with a small ruby set as the gem. We then go to Galadriel, Celeborn, and Celebrian, with the three of them discussing Elendil and what his motives could be. Galadriel is furious that the so-called Envoy of Valinor so quickly abandoned Lindon with the excuse of haste, only to tarry in her own lands. It seems that his haste lasted no more than a single journey. So much for the integrity of the messengers of Valinor. My love, Celeborn says, please do not slander the West again. I slander nothing. I merely state what I see with my own eyes. But mother, Celebrian says, do you know whether he is truly failing to fulfill his mission? Could it not be that he arrived at Eregion and found this land to be the most fitting for him to stay for the completion of his task? Is this not why Lord Elrond has come here with you? We see a flicker of a smile cross her face at the recollection of Elrond, though neither of her parents seem to notice it. He stated to the High King that his message must be delivered to the realms of the elves. Well, what other realms ought he go to? We do have further brethren along the coast, and some just to the east of the Misty Mountains, Celeborn says. It is true that if he ought to be delivering his message to the elven realms, then there is some neglect on his part. Perhaps he was merely in such haste to save the decay of the world that when he was presented with the smiths of such quality as Celebrimbor, he had no choice but to remain here. He is apparently in such haste as to exchange only a few words with the High King, and to neglect his counsel as well as ours, to come to our realm and turn our guild of smiths to his side in our absence. Do you not see why I am skeptical of his motivations? I honestly do not, Celebrian says with growing frustration. I think your skepticism is unfair. A change takes place in Galadriel's face, looking at her daughter with a new realization. Celebrian, why are you so ardent in your desire to defend him? Celebrian opens her mouth as if to speak, but then quickly shuts it and walks away. Celeborn likewise gains an understanding of what's going on and smiles for a moment before turning to his wife and saying, regardless of our daughter's motives, her reasoning is likely not too far off from the truth. Galadriel shakes her head. No, it is wrong. Celeborn raises an eyebrow. What makes you so certain? My dear, don't you see the obvious? Celebrimbor and the other master smiths have been in Moria for the past 2 years procuring mithril and creating that door, which means this Elendil already knew about them before coming to Eregion and made sure he was long established by the time they returned. This was a plan of his, and we need to find out what it was he was planning. Celeborn's eyes widen for a moment as he realizes she's right. He turns to look out from the balcony on which they stand over the rest of their kingdom, with a particular eye pointed towards the Gwathi Myrdain. Very well, let's find out what he's up to. We find Glorfindel assisting the Harfoots up the falls of Raros. He is first assisting Marigold and her family up the western side of the falls, but is disturbed when he hears a yelp echo in the east. He turns his head to try and locate it. What is it? Marigold asks. I suppose you didn't hear that? No? Wait. Are you making fun of my hearing too? I get it. You've got better eyes and ears and noses. Well, only one nose, but still, you don't need to rub it in. She has a smile on her face when she says this. Glorfindel smiles as well, having grown accustomed to her sense of humor, but a frown overtakes him shortly after. Marigold, I'm afraid this is not the time for jokes. There is likely danger about. Surprisingly, Marigold actually does become serious. But that shouldn't be possible. There's no way the orcs have already made it all the way up here. They don't travel this far north, and there are too many Ensign men. Glorfindel contemplates all the tarrying they've done in the past few months and says, I'm not so sure about that. He then looks back to the place where he heard the yelp and says, and besides, I don't believe it is orcs we are dealing with. Well, if there are bad guys around, then we can't just leave half the Harfoots at the top or the bottom. We definitely can't send them through the forest, so can we deal with it later? Glorfindel sighs with resignation. I suppose we have to. After Marigold and Amber are safely to the top, Glorfindel once more goes down to assist the rest of the Harfoots up the fall. Towards the bottom, he meets a young couple who at first are rather courteous and gracious for all the assistance he has provided the halflings. In reply to which, Glorfindel says that he is not being wholly unselfish, for the quicker they meet with the stores, the sooner he can continue with his task. They continue with the conversation. It becomes clear that they, just like the rest of the Harfoots, merely view him as a pawn in their house politics game. They begin attempting to lure Glorfindel away from Marigold and her family and towards their own house, as if he were just a prize with which they could brag to the others. It is at this point that he realizes where his staying with these people will end, in violence amongst themselves, and in completely neglecting directions for him. Therefore, Glorfindel leaves them and goes back to Marigold to tell her that he will be leaving, for he can no longer tolerate this sort of thing. However, just after climbing to the top of the falls, he hears about several Harfoot families who have climbed to the eastern side and have disappeared. Suspicious, especially in conjunction with the noise from earlier, he goes across the water and spots warg tracks. He pursues them to find a small pack of about 5 wargs, having surrounded and killed several members of a Harfoot family alongside a group of stores, who are also mostly dead. He saves the halflings by killing all but one warg. He sends them back to the others, and after they are out of earshot, he takes the one captive warg and tells him to return to his master and inform him that these people are under the protection of Valinor. The warg runs, and Glorfindel sneakily pursues after him. Our next scene has Minister looking at the token given to him by Valinor. It is a simple amulet, but he knows it must have been a truly prized possession to such a poor man. He looks to the east as a vision of a large black cloud stretching forth from the mountains comes to him. The cloud continues to expand and comes to swallow the Numenoreans, and we see that he has some sort of realization as he looks about the lands of Middle-earth that they are approaching. He once more speaks to Valinor and Minister, saying that he now truly realizes the darkness of their present situation in Middle-earth. Says, "Perhaps the people of Middle-earth really do need us, even more than the people of Numenor." They are sailing up through the Anduin from the sea to reach Pelargir, but as they do so, they pass a long series of abandoned towns and cities, and they begin to wonder what's going on. Once they reach Pelargir, they find it bursting with refugees and people in the streets. They confront the Numenorean magistrates to ask what is going on, and he informs them of recent events, and specifically that the rest of the people in this part of the world have fled north to Emin Arnin, and the fortress is about to be besieged. The Numenoreans then depart, going further up the Anduin. In a short scene, we see that the halflings who were rescued by Glorfindel quickly sailing across the river to get to the western side of the falls, and informing everyone else to do so. Marigold, however, looks to the east with suspicion. And for our final scene of the episode, we cut back to Arondir, who is staring out towards the south of the fortress. We see that everyone has been recalled into the fortress, including the farmers. The men are asleep in beds scattered throughout the towers and on the walls in the late summer night, while the elves keep vigil. We see several elvish scouts returning to the fortress, and their leader quickly goes to Arondir. "They are coming," he says. Arondir nods. He goes to wake Gath, but finds that he is already awake and is speaking with Bronwyn. The two of them seem to be rather enjoying each other's company, talking about a variety of things, whether it be medicine or politics, or even the differences of their own people. And Arondir smiles, seeing the two of them together, before then remembering his task and frowning. He goes to them and says, "We must be ready. The orcs will be here before dawn. Bronwyn and Gath, rise and prepare for the battle." Our episode opens with a quiet overview of the orcs creating some siege weapons, as well as some minor fortifications outside the walls. There are a few skirmishes which reach the walls, and a few traded arrows while Arondir attempts to use a combination of sorties and under-exaggerations of strength to entice the orcs to assault the fortress. But in the end, no assault comes. We see that there are only about 1,000 or 2,000 orcs besieging the fortress. Arondir then turns to Gath and sorrowfully states that they're going to wait for a siege. Still, we see the large provisions which have been made and that the fortress has been fully prepared. Arondir readies his men for the siege, and they hold firm under the initial harassments of the orcs. In our next scene, we have Celebrimbor meeting with Narvi in the halls of Khazad-dûm. We can see that the city is still under construction, and overall it should look like the beginnings of what we see in Lord of the Rings. Long, tall pillars hold up the main hall, as Celebrimbor is led to the king. Narvi introduces Celebrimbor to King Durin, and the king, while remaining dignified and being sure not to dote upon his guest, still rises and bows to Celebrimbor Celebrimbor and leads him to the dining hall. A great feast is laid out. It is not quite on the level of splendor the audience may be used to when it comes to the food, but the table, the arrayment of jewels, and everything else having to do with the metalwork is of such exquisite craftsmanship that Celebrimbor cannot help but marvel and compliment the dwarves for their grandeur. Indeed, he says, you and your people have never failed to impress me with all the wonders you are able to produce with just the power of your hands and a few simple tools. His eyes dart to Narvi for a moment and he smiles. And some elvish advice, of course. Narvi smiles at the comment and replies, Father, what my friend here says is silliness. Our greatest towers do not match the grandeur of their cities. Our tools are as nothing compared to the great elven swords and armor. It will drive a mind to fascination beyond belief, seeing what the elves are capable of. With the help of the dwarves, that is. Both Celebrimbor and Narvi smile profusely at their comments, while Durin shakes his head at their ridiculous friendship and begins discussing various small matters. Durin says that he has heard that Celebrimbor's king and queen have returned from their journey north, and Celebrimbor confirms. Durin asks if they have completed their task, with Celebrimbor saying that he can't be quite sure, and that there are likely other problems with the world they will need to bring their attention to, but he says nothing about what these problems might be. Narvi then remembers that they were set to complete the Moria Gate within a month or so, but Celebrimbor says that he might not be able to attend them for some time. What do you mean? Narvi asks. Celebrimbor pauses for a moment before saying, I'm not quite sure I will be able to have the time for travel over the coming months. It pains me as much as you, but I'm afraid we may have to postpone the completion of the Moria Gate. Narvi smiles and looks suspiciously at his friend. This is not merely to prolong our completion of it, I hope. My friend, as I said only a few months ago, we shall no doubt find another task on which we can both work. Celebrimbor frowns once more, but nods. We see that King Durin has paused his eating to look in disguised disbelief at his elvish guest. Say, my good elf, I was informed recently that your kingdom has also been receiving a guest of great prestige. Am I correct? Celebrimbor gives a momentary bit of shock at the question. Oh, yes, a herald from the west who has taken to instructing many of the craftsmen of our realm. The guilds are currently working on various devices to see if the advice that he gives us will prove at all useful. And what is your opinion on the matter? The king asks. Celebrimbor smiles. I am always looking for additional help wherever I can get it. The art of smithery is held by no individual. It is shared by all, and one of the great glories of friendship, he turns over to Narvi, is in the sharing of knowledge. That is, I believe, the key to the mutual success of our realms. Durin nods. Well spoken, my friend. After Celebrimbor leaves, we see the king and Narvi going about their daily business. When they're alone, the king turns to Narvi. You notice it as well, I hope. Surely you detected the strange behavior of your friend this evening. Indeed, I would have imagined you would have been the first to figure it out. Figure what out? Celebrimbor is hiding something. Oh, that. Yes, I'm already aware of this. Ever since Sale's messenger arrived, the elves have been working on some secret project or something along those lines. And you decided not to notify me about this? I didn't think it was worthy of concern. Not worth... My son, the elves are meant to be very intimate trading and business partners, and yet they're keeping secrets from us? How could that not be considered worthy of concern? Does that not at least seem a little inappropriate? Father, I don't think this is the time for being suspicious. We have worked hard to establish a real sense of trust between our kingdoms. But that is why I am worried. It seems the elves do not trust us. That is one possibility, of course, but they could just as easily be under direction not to reveal any specifics from this Southland deal that Celebrimbor has told me about. I still don't like it. We need to find out what they're up to. Narvi sighs again. Very well, Father, but let me, if I may, recommend caution rather than haste. We will discover the truth of this matter one way or another, and it will certainly be the benefit of our realm if we do so naturally rather than by force. King Durin considers this for a moment before nodding. You are growing to be a truly wise dwarf, my son. That will do you well as king. Very well. We shall wait before making any hasty action. But if the elves do not reveal their task in some manner by the spring's end, we must discover what they are up to. Narvi bows to his father. In our next scene, we see Glorfindel apart from the Harfoots early in the morning. He's searching various paths in the forest for traces of where the wargs from last episode came from, as he somehow lost the warg he was following. Eventually, he rediscovers the warg tracks and begins to follow them, but is interrupted by Marigold, who accuses him of trying to run away from them. Marigold! What are you doing here? This isn't safe. Did you not see how many of you were killed by just a few of those creatures? It's clear that Marigold isn't paying attention. I should have known that you'd try to abandon me. You've been keeping secrets this entire time, ever since you first agreed to come, and now you're going to leave without even saying Marigold, keep your voice down. No, you're not going to tell me what to do. Ah, so you really are aligned with the halflings, a voice says from behind the trees. We turn to find Khamul riding upon a black horse and being surrounded by his guards. What value you find in them, I'm not sure. They would make good spies, I suppose, but that's not even how you're using them. Glorfindel draws his sword and says calmly, Who are you? Khamul is caught off guard by the elf's serenity. Then he smiles. Admittedly, I am someone of little importance compared to you. You threaten to harm innocent men and women. Surely you do not mean to imply that this does not increase your importance to me. Innocent? I know of no such people. Make no mistake, elf. The people you guard are no more innocent than my own, and you ought not to make so many hasty judgments about circumstances of which you only just now grasp. You are attempting to turn me aside from the path set for me by the Valar. You must forgive me if I do not accept your judgment on the innocence of others. I've told no lie. That was not my contention. Khamul shakes his head and sends the wargs to attack Glorfindel. We then get a relatively quick battle, where the 10 wargs charge him at once. He kills 2 of them with relative ease as they approach, but the wargs coordinate to attack his limbs, causing him to drop his sword. Within a moment, Glorfindel stumbles, with a warg biting each of his limbs, and the lead warg jumping to attack his neck. He manages to dodge this by throwing all of his weight to one side, and collapsing on top of the warg biting his sword arm, with the wargs overwhelmed by the force of his fall. The lead warg once again attempts to go for a kill, while another warg swipes at his back. Glorfindel then retrieves his sword and kills the lead warg. He then whips out a small dagger from his belt, and kills the 2 wargs attempting to reattach to his legs. The rest of the wargs retreat, and there's a standoff. Khamul, however, seeing that this battle is ultimately pointless, knowing that Glorfindel will simply heal most of his wounds within a day or so, instead takes a different tactic. Very well. We'll have to finish this later. For now, make your choice. He sends the wargs to attack the Harfoots while they're making their way up the river. They chase them through the Emyn Muil, while Khamul retreats on his horse and Glorfindel is torn between pursuing him and saving the Harfoots. He spots Marigold trying to go back to her family and, cursing himself, goes after her. We then see that the wargs have called together a great number of their kind, though why they did not all go to attack Glorfindel is unclear. Glorfindel then realizes that Marigold is going to get herself killed as she tries to fight the wargs blocking her path to the rest of the Harfoots. Therefore, he saves her and brings her westwards into the forest to flee the frenzied wolves. In our next scene, we see Varix, the king of Angmar, emerging from his own personal chambers in a tower within Galadriel and Celeborn's palace. He seems to be questioning something as he starts pacing back and forth until one of his servants arrives. You called, Your Grace, the servant says. Eirik, what is your opinion on all we have learned these past few months? It's not my place to question. It's your place to question when I tell you to. Tell me the effect of what you have learned. Eirik bows his head. Well, Your Grace, I have learned how to read and write. I have learned the history of Middle-earth and the lands beyond our own. I have learned much about the ways of the world, and I have even been given instruction on how I may best advise you. Varix looks concerned. Is that all? Have you learned any means of power? I have studied military history and learned much better ways to organize armies. Varix nods and seems to breathe a sigh of relief. Good. I believe I can work with this. Your Grace. Varix turns his head towards his servant. I have learned much in my time here as well, but nothing has been anywhere near as useful in our struggle to survive as what I have received from my forefathers. If I may, Your Grace, Eirik says cautiously. I appreciate the need to survive, more than many of our other members of court, as I'm sure you know, but we have fought so long and so hard against the orcs. Our people know of little else but war. The elves are offering us a life beyond the mere struggles with orcish raids, and if we learn from them we may, as you said, become truly great in our own right. You've been learning persuasion from them as well, I see. Eirik briefly blushes from embarrassment before regaining himself. But what I've said is true nonetheless, and I believed what you say. I really did. Why has your mind changed, Your Grace? Varix once more snaps at the younger man. Because I don't have time for this. The elves have taken nearly 2 seasons to teach us the most rudimentary of administrative and literary skills. At this rate, it will take ages before any of us are masters enough to teach these skills to our own people. He shakes his head. We are children indeed. with children already on our deathbed, with disease and assassins lurking in every corner. It was foolish of me to believe I could end our people's curse. Your Grace, Eirik says, bowing. While what you're saying may be true, do we not have hope that we shall survive this time of troubles? Our people have been given a great fortress over which to look, and we have men learning many crafts of farming which we could use even now to help our people. Varix shakes his head. I have no heir, Eirik. The woman I loved died years ago, and in my foolishness I never took another. If I do not create peace for our kingdom before I die, it shall not last. Eirik bows lower as he speaks with greater caution than ever before. It is certainly not my place to judge motive, Your Grace, but, as you know, friends may often have insights into another man which he himself lacks. Is it not possible that you are associating your own good with the good of Angmar? Varix eyes his servant with a mixture of anger and shame. Get out, is all he says. Eirik bows and leaves, and Varix is left for a few moments to his own thoughts before Eirik returns with Aurendil. Varix's face convulses into anger when he sees the one he believes to be a false envoy. What is he doing here? Eirik carries a nervous expression. Pardon, Your Grace, please. He absolutely insisted on seeing you. Varix glares at Aurendil. Do you think you can abuse my servants without punishment? He approaches the envoy. I don't care if you're some envoy from the west. I will find a way to make you pay if you do anything to disturb my people. Varix dismisses him and turns to go. How long do you think it will last? Aurendil says. Varix pauses. Surely, you know, once you pass, so does the gift. Varix turns to Aurendil with poison in his eyes. He squints with suspicion at the envoy, who is simply standing at the center of the room, his own face expressionless. What do you want? In truth, I have not come to get anything from you. Lord of Gifts, my friend Celebrimbor calls me, and so I am. I have come to give you something that will help your people with their orcish problem. Varix's frown deepens. I'm listening. In our next scene, we see Glorfindel speaking with a group of Entwives, warning them of the danger and telling them to alert the settlements of men. You've once again forgotten about the halflings! Marigold screams at him. Glorfindel sighs, then adds, Please also try to find the Harfoots in the stores. The Harfoots have a slightly darker complexion than you're probably used to. They were attacked by the wargs, and I am worried for their safety. He glares back at Marigold. Marigold, Glorfindel yells. I have tried to be patient and kind to you and your people, and you all have repaid me with deceptions and delays. You used me in your ridiculous and pointless politicking, and now you are actively hampering my mission. I didn't want any of that stupid family stuff. I just wanted a friend. I don't have time for a friend, Marigold. The evil of Morgoth and his followers has not gone from the world. If I do not warn the kingdoms of the High Elves, you are all going to die. Marigold stops, and her eyes widen. What? Glorfindel breathes a sigh of frustration at his mistake. Go back to your people, if you can. I have already wasted more than a season. Reluctantly, he looks at the Entwives and says, And I have a better guide now. He follows the Entwives and goes up the hill they are leading before pausing. He turns around and looks back towards the east, not towards Marigold, but instead to the lands beyond the Anduin. He is clearly troubled and hesitates when one of the Entwives calls for him to follow, looking almost as if he's reluctant to do what he had just said. We then see a scene where Aurendil and Celebrimbor are working on the 9 rings. The work is put in the form of a montage, implying that these things happened over the course of several months or maybe even years. While working, we see the envoy give various pieces of advice on how to achieve mastery over the powers of the world, sharing notes and making suggestions, but above all watching with a keen eye all the actions of his fellow smiths. Celebrimbor, he says, smiling profusely, I must admit I have never seen a smith quite on your level. You are master not only of gifts, but of flattery, my lord. But surely you do not wish to say that I exceed the skill of my grandsire, Feanor. It is well known that in comparison to all the other craftsmen of the world, he alone stands as a star of unimpeachable brightness. Next to him, I am but a paltry blacksmith, a maker and repairer of horseshoes, not fit to be called a master. Perhaps, Aurendil says, though I will admit that I never saw Feanor as a smith. So secretive he was, after all. Celebrimbor laughs for a moment, assuming this to be a joke. Aurendil continues. Besides, of all the crafts of Feanor, were not as greatest the Silmarils, gems meant for his own enjoyment? These rings, however, these are the works intended for the salvation of the world, in addition to their unmatchable achievement. The Silmarils brought destruction. These will bring new life. The Silmarils preserve the light of the 2 trees. These will preserve the light of the whole world. Surely you understand why I hold these in higher estimation than the works of Feanor. Celebrimbor smiles and nods before returning to his work. Elendil continues to watch before gaining a contemplative expression. One of the other elven smiths looks at him. My lord, what is it? Oh, nothing. I'm merely considering something about our Lord Celebrimbor. It is possible. Yes, I think he may truly be worthy. Celebrimbor stops again. Worthy, my lord. Elendil blushes. That probably wasn't the wisest thing to say. He then sighs. I know of many arts which are usually considered too dangerous to teach, even to elves, but you, my lord, may be the exception. Celebrimbor, almost reflexively, genuflects in front of Elendil. My lord, I am honored that you would even consider me worthy of such gifts. I know not what to say other than to ask, to what do these arts pertain? Elendil hesitates, taking Celebrimbor's hands and then raising him to his feet. I am afraid I need more discernment time, my friend. I worry that my judgment may not be as impeccable as I had once thought. Why do you say this? Well, your Lady Galadriel seems not to trust my judgments. Surely, he turns to the entire guild, all understand why the lack of confidence from one so widely known for her wisdom would cause doubt for one's own mind. My lord, one of the smiths says, do not rely on Galadriel for your own estimation. Celebrimbor hesitates, but eventually adds, I would not ordinarily be so bold, but I do think the Lady Galadriel's sight is not as keen when it comes to our current task. Elendil raises an eyebrow. Indeed? Perhaps you are right. Our lady does not seem to understand the gravity of the situation or the extent of our work here. He shakes his head. I did not plan on telling you all this, but I have heard it said that she wishes to restrict or even enclose this guild of ours. Shock echoes throughout the hall. I do not believe this is true, he quickly adds. I believe this is based on the suspicions of some of our members who have seen her and our Lord Celebrimbor lurking throughout the guild. They've been watching us, we hear a voice say. Will Galadriel let jealousy ruin our work? Another cries out. Enough, Elendil says. He shakes his head and turns to Celebrimbor. My lord, in either case, this should not pose any problems to you. You yourself are a lord of Eregion in your own right. She cannot merely strip you of your rights and powers. As he says this, we see Celebrian enter the guild and walk towards them. Elendil spots her and calls out, Ah, the silver star of the Eldar has blessed us with her presence. He bows low and kisses her hand as she draws near. My dearest, what can I do for you? Celebrian fights a blush as she says, I wanted to let you know that my mother and father are coming here, and mother seems particularly angry with you. She's coming to close the guild, one of the smiths says hysterically. What? No, that's not what she's after, Celebrian insists. We shall see, my darling, Elendil says. Right on cue, Galadriel and Celeborn enter the guild with some of their guard. Elendil, Galadriel yells, your ruse is up. I have received word from the High King and learned of your harassing my guests. I will tell the— Lady Galadriel, Elendil bellows before putting on a conciliatory smile. The violence of the outburst and the odd juxtaposition of the smile throws Galadriel off balance. I am afraid, he continues with a softer voice, that my fate is not currently in your power. I am under the protection of our Lord Celebrimbor, if he will provide it. Galadriel looks around and sees that all the smiths have turned against her. She turns to Celebrimbor. My Lord Celebrimbor, she begins, this man has long overstepped what is proper in his dealings with us as envoy of Valinor. For the good of Eregion, and on behalf of the High King, I bid you, please turn him over to me. We will not, Celebrimbor says, hand over our rights and jurisdictions to you. Galadriel looks at him confused. What are you talking about? I wonder, Elendil interrupts, whether one so hasty and fickle in turning away, guess, from the Valar themselves, will respect the rights and privileges she has granted to her inferiors. This comment foments anger throughout the guild, and Galadriel, after giving Elendil one final stare of hatred, leaves with her husband and guard. In our next scene, we see Marigold crying, her eyes glued to the ground, stumbling her way through the forest back to the river, when suddenly she hears what at first feels like a stampede. She sneaks her way through the forest and sees a massive army of wargs and men moving west. It takes her only a few seconds to realize what is going on. She quickly looks around, trying to find some form of help, and spots smoke coming up from what is likely a settlement of men. She wipes her eyes as she gains a newly determined look. She pulls out a small amulet, which has been shown in previous shots to belong to her grandmother, and she runs towards the smoke as quickly as she can. And in our final scene for the episode, we turn to the fortress of Untitled. It is at sunset, and we see that the walls have taken some wear and tear from the siege weapons of the orcs, and the supplies have been nearly spent. The men all have heavy, baggy eyelids, while the elves remain vigilant. Even so, they appear to be getting more and more tired as the siege wears on. Even Arendir appears exhausted in his command, but attempts to persevere throughout and provide encouragement to the defenders. Then, just as the sun becomes no longer visible, the assault horn of the orcs sounds, and the defenders are snapped out of their malaise. Arendir looks at the fortress in sorrow, and yet, despite the sorry state, regains his resolve. "Now, my friends," he shouts to the rest of the defenders, "we at last have a chance to destroy the orcs in this land for good." We begin with a shot of Narvi approaching Ostendethil with a few of his guards during the night and calling them to halt. He notices how the city seems to be awake despite the late hour, and one of the guards asks if they could have been prepared for their coming. Narvi looks more closely as they approach. He turns to two of his guards and tells them to scout out the condition of the eastern gate. The dwarves do so, while the remaining guard asks how he intends to enter the city. "I already told you," Narvi says. "Your job is to simply follow my lead and be on the lookout for guards." The dwarf is unfazed by this and continues. "My prince, I was willing to go along with whatever plan you had because I thought you would be capable of keeping everything under control. With the city on high alert, I am not so confident anymore. The other two are gone. Please, I need to know what we intend to do so that if something goes wrong, I can more effectively get us out of trouble." Narvi eats a piece of dried meat and sighs. He looks in the direction where his other two guards went before saying, "There's a tunnel under the city which Celebrimbor taught me how to access, in case I ever wanted to meet him without the knowledge of the other elves. We're going to use that to enter the city, and then I will lead us to the Gwaithir Myrdain. My hope is that we can get into the guild and get out as quickly as possible. I still don't understand why you refused to tell us this plan. The entrance to the tunnel is closed off by a door of my own design. As such, only I know how to open it. I'm going to command you to look away so that it will remain unknown. I will not have knowledge of my friend's secret spread amongst common dwarves, especially when this is something not even my father knows." "Prince Narvi," one of the guards who had left says as he runs back towards the two of them. "Good news. Not only has there been no additional guard, there is in fact no guard posted at the gate or on the walls. It seems that the city is roused over some internal dispute." The other guard turns to Narvi, expecting his prince to have taken the news well. Instead, Narvi's face has become hard, as if this news troubles rather than excites him. "Very well," the prince says. "We shall move forward with the plan," and he moves towards the steep hill bordering the eastern section of the city. Once they arrive there, Narvi turns expectantly to the guard who remained with him. The guard shakes his head. "Oh, very well. Lads, the prince desires that we keep a watch while he's working. There may still be a trap for us before we're able to enter the city." The other two guards nod their head and move into positions to be on the lookout for any potential ambushes. Narvi then says the password to get into the gate. "Gweth," and immediately enters and prepares to shut the door. "Wait," one of the guards says. "My prince, you are forgetting us. I have decided to change the plan. I want you three to wait here. I will discover what the elves have been up to, and whether or not we can complete the mission. The elves will not come here. Therefore, if you remain, you will be secret. If you move, your chance of being caught is far greater, and you will ruin this whole operation." As he says this, the door closes and the three guards are left outside. The two others look at the head guard who had remained with Narvi and say, "What should we do?" The head guard simply shakes his head. "I suppose we'll have to do what he asks." Therefore, they move to hide behind a rock. In our next scene, the orcs are attacking the fortress of Untitled. They have three main groups, each going to a different section of the wall. To the west, the orcs have prepared a sapping tunnel. To the southeast, they have built makeshift catapults to tear down the walls, with the main assault coming towards the southern gate, attempting to use a battering ram to break through. The orcs in the western assault see that the wall has been largely removed of defenders, and so begin the sapping in earnest while getting the assault teams ready to enter the fortress once the wall is brought down. It is then that the ambush begins, as men and a few elves jump out from behind rocks and bushes and begin hacking at the small orcish formations. The orcs are completely caught off guard by this counterattack and flee into the forest. The men and elves then retreat to the walls and are helped back up by ropes and ladders. The main bulk of the western orc group, however, sees this and uses it as an opportunity opportunity to attack the defenders. They charge from the forest towards the walls and attempt to close in on the ambushers. The camera looks up and we see about 25 elven and about 40 human archers, sending volley after volley at the orcs. The ambushers likewise turn and face the orcs, who are small in number and disorganized by the time they reach the wall, and thus they are effectively cut down before eventually the others turn and run away. This time, the ambushers make their way up the rope successfully, as the camera pans up, and we see Arondir smiling at the success of his plan. Once everyone has been rescued, he turns his attention to the other two assaults. He moves towards the eastern section of the wall, and most of the archers follow him. Then, however, he stops, noticing that the catapults, even after having sent several volleys, have done at most negligible damage to the outer wall. "You three," he says, calling to one elvish and two human commanders. "Man the eastern portion of the wall with your men, and keep a close eye on its general stability and damage. Otherwise, I do not think any major assault will be able to come this way tonight. Estian, Gath, prepare your sortie at the main gate and ride out when I blow the horn. The rest of you, get on top of or around the main gate and try to light the battering ram on fire." Everyone quickly goes to their stations, and Arondir goes to a lookout tower near the gate to keep an eye on the orcish movements. He cringes when he sees that the attempts to light the ram are of little effect, as the orcs did well to protect against this. "Change of plan," he shouts down to the others. "Focus your arrows on the groups behind the ram." He then blows the horn. Estian's group leads a force of elves out of a secret entrance towards the west of the main gate, and meets the carriers of the ram head-on. The orcs attempt to counter this by surrounding the group with their infantry reserves, though this is somewhat hindered by the archers above the gate, and thus the surround attempt is fairly slow. This allows for Gath and his men to charge out of the main gate with horses, the ram and its defenders having been effectively removed from the situation. The charge is devastating to the attacking orcs, and the already disjointed orcish infantry is trampled and eventually routed by the cavalry charge. The sortie then retreats back into the gate. Once he is sure that the main gate is secure, Arondir moves back over to the eastern side of the wall. The attack has done little to progress. Indeed, so ineffective were the catapults that the orcs have now retired them and began taking up ladders to attack the walls. Arondir, noticing this, therefore orders most of the archers to move towards the eastern portion of the wall, while he himself comes down to make sure everything goes smoothly. Once they arrive, the three groups from earlier come to Arondir. "The walls have been barely damaged, sir," the elvish commander says. "What are your orders about how to deal with the ladders?" Arondir smiles. "Oh, I don't think that they will be too much of an issue." He points to the field, and the commander notices that there are only a few sets of ladders approaching the walls. It appears that the orcs were unprepared. In addition to this, with the reinforcing archers from the main gate arriving, 3 of the ladder groups are effectively shot down before even reaching the wall. "Get ready," Arondir says to the defenders, who begin picking up large rocks as the ladders are hoisted onto the walls. "Now!" The rocks are thrown down and the ladders shatter. The archers continue to loose their arrows, and what few orcs are left flee into the forest. And with that, the first round of attacks have been repelled. The elves and men cheer and mock the retreating orcs before being addressed by Arondir. "Job well done, comrades. Your valor has dealt our enemy a decisive blow. But do not be deceived. The orcs are not wholly repelled. True, they have been beaten back for a time, but they will return, and soon. My only hope is that you have all earned yourselves a night's rest. For now, however, you must return to your positions and prepare for the next assault." However, as he finishes this speech, we see that an orc has snuck up within shooting range of the wall, and loses an arrow into his shoulder. A moment later, an elvish archer returns the favor, but Arondir is seriously impaired by the injury. After a moment of shock, Estian assumes command and tells Gath to carry Arondir into the citadel. Gath complies, taking a few of his guards with him as they carry the elven commander to the healing rooms which Bronwyn had set up. In our next scene, we see that Narvi has made his way through the tunnel and found the main road to the Gwathi Myrdain. He's still on his guard, checking around each corner for elves and making sure to stay out of sight. But eventually he sees a group of smiths whom he recognizes and watches them take out their weapons as they approach him. He panics and retreats back into the alley from which he came, only to find out that the elves took no notice of him, and instead seemed intent on going towards the center of the city. He looks at the guild once before letting his curiosity get the better of him, and he follows them to the city center. When he arrives, he finds a large gathering of guild members assembled around 2 elves. One of them Narvi immediately recognizes as his friend. and a look of guilt and fear spreads across his face. The other is an elf who seems to glow with his own radiance, whom Narvi identifies as likely being the envoy which Celebrimbor had told him about. The guild members continue to gather around Celebrimbor and Elendil, who is pretending to hesitate and wear a sorrowful face before the elves. It's clear that he's in the middle of a speech, and has been doing so for some time, and as Narvi approaches the main square, it becomes clear that they are getting progressively more riled up. Therefore, my friends, Elendil says, you all know of my great respect for the Lady Galadriel, but it has become clear to me that she does not fully appreciate the value of your work, and in such a drastic time and with such dire consequences, I'm afraid this means she will have to be removed from power. The smiths cheer, and Celebrimbor bids them draw their weapons before moving towards the palace to the north of the city. Narvi is in awe of the riot, and questions what is going on or how this could possibly have happened, before shaking his head and going back to the guild. At first, he is cautious as he approaches and enters, but soon he finds that it has been truly and completely abandoned for the riot, with the lights dimmed and, even surprisingly, locks undone. He moves through the guild to Celebrimbor's forge and finds there, displayed upon cushioned pedestals, 15 rings. In addition to this, he sees an old man concernedly looking at something in his hand. It appears as though the man hears Narvi, as he quickly puts away whatever was in his hand, and turns to face the dwarf, relaxing once he sees him. I'm sorry, my friend, you startled me, though I'm not sure this is the best time for you to be here. And why is that? Have you not seen the clamor on the streets? I have no doubt something dangerous is about to happen. And I don't believe that Celebrimbor will be here to see you. Narvi frowns and bows his head, and for a moment he looks as if he's almost ready to turn around and abandon this foolish mission. But something stops him, and he looks at the old man again. What is it that you are doing here? Me? Oh, I am only here to collect what I was promised. Indeed. And what is that? The old man, who by now, it should be obvious, is Varix, turns to the dwarf and frowns, with a look of sorrow and hunger in his eyes as he says only one word. Power. Narvi grows concerned and raises an eyebrow at this. Power? Power to do what? Wait, is this what the elves have been working to achieve? Is this what the envoy has been telling them to do? Whether they sought this, I do not know. But it is the result of their actions. In fact, I know nothing about what they intended to do with this power, nor do I particularly care. I only hope that I have been given enough strength to save my people. His words fade as he looks towards the door. Narvi quickly turns, but sees no one there. He turns back to Varix, and notices that he seems to be almost in a sort of trance. The old man walks out of the guild, and presumably goes back to his chambers. Narvi is deeply concerned by all of this. And yet, he looks upon the rings on the pedestals. He approaches one, seeming to frown more deeply with each step he takes. Once more, it seems as if he is ready to turn around and abandon the whole operation. Instead, with a force of will, he reaches out his hand and takes one of the rings. In our next scene, we return to Em and Arnon, with Erendir being brought into the healing rooms. Bronwyn is tending to some of the injured soldiers as they come through the doorway. My lady, Gath calls. I do not wish to value one life over another, but I'm afraid I have an emergency. Bronwyn looks up from her work and is overcome with horror as she sees who Gath is carrying into the room. She immediately rushes over to the elven commander, removes the arrow, stifles the blood flow, and attempts to figure out the poison after telling the servants to wash the wound with hot water. When she comes back, she approaches Lord Gath. I am amazed that our elvish commander is still alive. Really? Why is that? This is the single most powerful poison I've ever seen in my life. Gath looks at her skeptically. And how did you determine that? Never mind, she replies. The point is, it's a good thing that you moved with such haste to get here. She rushes back to Erendir as another elf comes into the room. He briefly whispers into Gath's ear and secretly hands him something. Bronwyn checks the wound again and breathes a sigh of relief, seeing that the damage is slowing, that some parts of the wound are already on the initial paths to healing, now that the poison has been taken out. She turns back to Gath to inform him of this, and notices that he has begun walking back towards the doorway. Wait! She calls to him. He stops. What are you doing? What I must, of course, Gath replies, revealing a piece of paper written in Estienne's hand. It seems as though I have earned the trust of both the men and the elves throughout the valley, and therefore they have appointed me acting commander until Arendir can be healed. Bronwyn stands up and approaches Gath cautiously. I do not think you should put yourself in the same position as this elf. Did you not see how severe the poison was? Elves, admittedly, have some internal power of healing, which I cannot hope to match even with the finest salves. And yet, unless I am gravely mistaken, our elven commander was mere moments away from death. If he could barely survive this, what chance do you have against such an arrow? Gath nods. He turns to Bronwyn. He sees her pained face, though he does his best to hide his own fears and pains. He looks into her eyes for a few moments and speaks to her only a single word. None. Then please, do not go. If you do, I fear you will die. I fear this as well. And I thank you for all you have done for me, but I cannot do as you ask. Tears begin to well in Bronwyn's eyes. But before she has a chance to protest, Gath continues, If I reject the call to defend this fortress, it would be the worst act of cowardice I have ever committed or that any of our people have ever committed. In the face of opposition, at the very same time that I command others to risk death, I sulk back into a citadel and hide behind its walls like a snail in its shell. He smiles. No. I have too much shame for that. He walks away a bit, moving towards the door, but not making any commitment to move out. Ever since I was a boy, my father spoke of the duties I had to those who served me. They had put their trust in my house, he said. I owed it to them, never to break that trust. And now, in their hour of greatest need, when orcs surround the last place of refuge for many of them, when their very existence is threatened, you would have me slink back into a protected hole for fear of orcish arrows. Bronwyn turns away. The rebuke, though said with a gentle voice, stings her, even greater than her fear of loss. Still, after a moment's hesitation, she runs over to embrace him. Gath strokes her hair gently before raising her chin and saying, Don't worry. I don't believe we shall perish this day. The walls are yet strong, and the orcs, though vast, are not without limit. Then, when our Lord Arendir is strong again, who knows? Perhaps we shall be able to ride out and chase them from our lands forever. Bronwyn says nothing in reply. Instead, she simply lets go of him and wipes her eyes, before bowing and returning to her work. Gath then exits the citadel and returns to the walls. He proves to be a capable commander in his own right, but he's nowhere near as good as Arendir, especially when it comes to reading what the enemy is up to. As such, he repels the first attack fairly effectively, but after this, he misreads the situation and concentrates most of the forces to the west wall to block a feint. Then, to his horror, he sees orcs walking through the southern gate and going directly towards the citadel. Gath realizes the situation too late, and even more to his horror, realizes that he was right about traitors. He keeps his men firm and moves them towards the citadel, hoping that Arendir had a contingency for this. But as they begin retreating, they find that several orcs have already made their way into the citadel, for a traitor has opened up the main gate to them as well. Gath sees his forces in disarray and does what he can to keep up organization and morale, but finds this to be only partially effective among his men, though the elves remain mostly disciplined. He quickly searches about for a solution to the problems. Commander Estian, he calls. I'm afraid I must ask you to bottleneck the main gate. If you can, retake it, of course, but if not, merely try to divert the orcs from their attempts to charge the main gate. Archers, take positions on the rooftops and pick off as many orcs as you can. Spears, pikes, do what you can to defend the archers within the buildings. The rest of you, come with me and we will reclaim the citadel. The group split up, and much to Gath's dismay, only about half the men follow the instructions. Many of them scramble to various parts of the fortress, either to hide or seek vengeance against the orcs, knowing that they've likely already gone into the citadel and started pillaging. Gath is nearly overwhelmed by it all, but manages to keep a level head and fulfill his end of the plan. He leads a group of footmen through the corridors of the fortress, maintaining order and cohesion as they fight through packs of orcs, some of whom have already taken to plunder. Eventually, they make it to the gate, which, to Gath's surprise, is still open. They run towards it. However, once they do, a group of orcs charges out to meet them, and another melee ensues. This time, however, Gath turns to find another group of orcs is charging to their right. He reorients the footmen to a more defensive posture, only to notice that another group of orcs is likewise flanking their left, and another is coming in behind them. They are surrounded. Gath creates a strong defensive posture, knowing that if only they can accept enough punishment, they may be able to cut their way out of the encirclement and retreat. Once this is accomplished, however, Gath hears the sound of a very familiar set of screams. He turns and finds a group of orcs coming through the gate, holding Bronwyn as well as many of the injured and other healers as they desperately try to keep from tripping. As they approach, the orc holding Bronwyn pulls a knife from his belt and, when they are close enough, places it on Bronwyn's throat. Gath is stupefied at the sight of this.
"Lay down your weapons,"
the orc chokes out.
"or I'll slit her throat."
Gath looks from Bronwyn to the rest of his men, and now it is time for tears to well up in his eyes. It is clear that he is actually considering both options, until he once more remembers the words of his father. His body shakes as he raises his head, and he looks once more at Bronwyn, his eyes wordlessly conveying his intention. Bronwyn nods and closes her eyes, ready to accept her fate.
"Prepare to fight your hardest battle yet," Gath shouts to the others. "Charge the gates!"
The orc bellows with anger and pulls back Bronwyn's head to expose her neck as the footmen begin to move towards the gate and the 4 orc groups charge towards them. Just as the orc is about to slash her neck, however, a horn blows in the distance, not the harsh sounds of the orc horns with which the people of these southern lands had become all too accustomed over the years. The sound was different. To these coastal men it was like the winds of the high seas when they are arrayed in wrath against the corsair, with a sea breeze as it blows up the Vale of Anduin, bringing word from the south. For in that darkest of hours for the people of Eminarnan, hope roused once again in their hearts when rescue, long since discounted, presented itself. For they looked to the south and saw that the Numenoreans had come. We briefly see the men of the west charging through the reserves of the orcs outside of the fortress, though there are not many of these left. Swiftly, they come in through the gate and begin clearing out the walls. The orcs, already tired from the siege and assault, are no match for them. Whether it be 20, 10, or even 5 Numenoreans in a group against 50 or even 100 orcs, the orcs prove to be no match for them. The seamen ride through the crumbling streets before dismounting and fighting on foot, sending the horses to safety. We see the orcs attempt to shoot and slash the Numenoreans, but to little effect, with seemingly only a couple of Numenoreans dying in the entire battle. Bronwyn uses the distraction to elbow her captor in the throat, allowing her to escape for a few moments. Gath orders the footmen to charge the gate, but this is prevented by the harrying attacks from the other groups of orcs. The footmen begin to break formation and the fighting becomes a melee, as Gath finally charges out and breaks through the orcs in the direction of the gate. Bronwyn's captor is continuing to chase after her as she runs, having reclaimed his knife and being mad with anger. He manages to trip her by throwing a rock at her leg. Bronwyn falls to the ground as the orc catches up to her, pulls out his sword and swings down to cut off her head. But just as the strike begins, Gath reaches the orc and tackles him to the ground. The two of them begin fighting for their lives by attempting to kill each other while wrestling. The orc clearly proves to be more skilled in this regard, and within moments he pins Gath to the ground and breaks his right arm, which he had been using to try and get the orc off of him, and is about to crush his head with his hands. Then, right as Gath begins to scream from the pressure, the orc's hands move away and the orc himself falls backwards, revealing Bronwyn having stabbed through the back of the orc's neck with his own knife. Gath tries to get up, but finds he cannot. Bronwyn runs to help him sit. "See," Gath says, I told you we wouldn't die today." Bronwyn chokes on her tears after a failed attempt at a laugh. "I wouldn't count on that as a certainty yet."
"Oh, but it is. Look around."
Bronwyn looks around at the rest of the fortress and finds that the Numenoreans have already arrived at the citadel and dispatched the orcs who surrounded the footmen. One of them, a younger man, approaches Gath and Bronwyn and bows his head to them before saying in a soft yet clear voice amidst all the sounds of battle, "My lord, my lady, I would like to know who the commander of this fortress is. I was informed by the fair warriors within the fortress that I would find him near the gate, and I wish to speak with him." Gath is still in awe of the grandeur of legend being presented to him. Still, he collects himself and speaks. For the time being, I am the commander, though our true commander lies resting within the citadel." "Indeed. That is curious. I've not heard of elves being willing to take commands from a common man such as yourself." "Neither had I," Gath says as Bronwyn and the Numenorean help him to his feet. "Nor do I feel fit to command at the moment. If you are able to find him, tell Estian that I give him full command of the citadel on account of an injury." As you wish, the Numenorean man says before going into the citadel. Gath and Bronwyn are, at this point, both so overwhelmed by all that has happened and by their injuries, that they find they have no strength to walk. The day, however, is not finished with them, for they turn to find that the men and elves who had defended the fortress but were still outside the citadel, cheering Gath for his bravery and staying strong in the face of treachery. Bronwyn and Gath both find themselves barely able to resist the overwhelming feelings of relief and joy at the sight. In our next scene, we are back in Ostendethil. The Smiths have begun to break into the courtyard of the palace and are even attacking the guards. We see Galadriel and Celeborn standing on their balcony, discussing how to deal with this situation. They are both terrified of the notion of fighting back, as the idea of kinslaying is virtually off limits to them, but still, they recognize that the fault would not be theirs if it came to that. Eventually, the riot turns into a near frenzy as the guards are forced to abandon their outer positions and barely manage to come into the palace. Luckily, they manage to imprison one of the Smiths, but this leads to nothing productive. Meanwhile, we see that Narvi is making his way out of Oregion and already on the way back to Moria. The 3 guards did indeed remain at their posts as he comes out of the door. "Did all go well?" one of the guards asks. Narvi nods, though he is even more troubled than before. "Let's go back home. I want this to be over with as quickly as possible." As they are leaving the valley, he looks back and shakes his head, wondering why the Smiths would start such a riot, and so suddenly against Galadriel of all people. Eventually he voices these concerns to his guards, and the head guard asks if they should investigate further. Narvi, however, shakes his head. "No. We have what we came for, without being seen. If we make ourselves known, then they'll likely figure out that we were involved one way or another." Narvi drops his head and once more begins walking along the road back to Moria. Back in the city, we see Elendil approach Celebrian. "My dear," he yells out to her in a sweet voice. "Elendil," she says back to him. "What on earth is going on? I see the palace surrounded and the Smiths shouting for my mother's arrest." Elendil's face is full of sorrow. "I'm afraid that a riot has started. The Smiths are troubled by Her Majesty's actions against them, and there seems to be little hope to quell them." "What are you saying?" "I believe the only way to bring peace to the situation is to resolve the dispute, and I believe that you may be able to help with this." "Really? How?" "Well, surely you know of a way to get into the palace besides the main gate. Perhaps you could tell one of them to myself and Lord Celebrimbor." "But wouldn't he tell the rest of the Smiths as well?" "I'm afraid so. It seems that Lady Galadriel has left us with no other options." "Wait. No! You actually mean to depose my mother?" Elendil attempts to extend a hand to her cheek. "Now, my sweet Celebrian, however, recoils. "Don't call me that! Get away from me!" Elendil then stands dumbfounded at Celebrian. "I don't understand," he says. "I thought we had an understanding, and now you're He is once more cut off, this time by the sound of horns. Celebrian's face brightens as she turns in the direction of the sound. "The High King is coming. Perhaps he shall be able to resolve this dispute." He turns to Elendil, half hoping that he too is excited at the prospect, only to find that he has somehow completely disappeared. Once the horn of Gilgalad rings throughout the city, the Smiths turn to each other, and a sense of fear and embarrassment comes upon all of them. The High King comes into sight after only a few moments, with a grand procession as the first rays of sunlight begin to peek over the misty mountains. He looks grimly, but with no hint of surprise, upon the armed Smiths surrounding the palace. "Smiths of Oregion, what is your business standing about the palace of Lord Celebrimbor and Lady Galadriel, armed as you are? Could it be that some threat has come upon the city and you are preparing for its defense? If so, I would have imagined more effort should have been made to man the outer walls, which I found bereft of guard altogether. Or perhaps you were hoping to make a demonstration of your newly crafted weapons. Though, if this were the case, I would advise you to save such displays until after the sun shines her rays upon the city." "High King," Celebrimbor says, "we have had a dispute break out between us and the Queen concerning the work necessary to save Arda from the corruption of Morgoth, as I'm sure you know." "Indeed, I have heard that this Elendil has been counseling you concerning this matter." Celebrimbor grows worried. "High King, we shall deal with these matters in a moment. For now, lay down your weapons and allow the King and Queen to leave their palace." Celebrimbor and the other Smiths obey. "My friends," Gilgalad calls to the palace, "you may now leave unmolested. Please, we have much to discuss and resolve. To finish off this episode, we see that the elves and the Numenoreans have rounded up the remainder of the orcs within the fortress and imprisoned them. Minister, Valinor, and Asilmo come into the healing room to meet with Arendir, who has already recovered enough to begin speaking. Along with him is Estian and the other elvish commanders, as well as Gath. "I do not wish to scold any of you," says Valinor, "who have only just been relieved of a devastating siege and a worse battle. But why has the situation with the orcs not been told to us before?" The elves and men look at each other before Estian speaks. "In truth, we have only recently come to know of their true strength, and when this became clear to us, we told the seamen at Pelargir that we were on our way to the fortress. We had hoped to build up and defend this realm, but we were quickly found and besieged. This led us to believe that there were traitors in our midst," Gath says, "and this was confirmed in the battle, wherein both the main and inner gates were open for the orcs, allowing them to storm in unopposed while we were distracted." "The orcs had already stormed your citadel?" Minister says. "But how can that be? The inner citadel looks as if it has seen nothing of the battle, nor any looting." "There was not much time before your arrival," Estian explains, but Minister is still suspicious. He calls over one of the Numenorean guards and sends him away on some task. "In either case," Gath says, "now that the full force of the orcs has made itself known, we would greatly appreciate your protection. We ask you only that you allow us to maintain our customs and our way of life." "Of course," Asilmo says. "That is, after all, our custom." They continue to speak about the proposed alliance when the guard from earlier comes back. "It is as you suggested, Lord Minister. The soldiers and civilians are unharmed, but the armory and the treasury were thoroughly raided." "What?" Arendir and Gath say at the same time. "Do they know what was taken?" "Many things were taken by the look of it, but the main target appears to be a device that was under the heaviest protection." "Ought we not merely to search among the orcs for whatever was lost?" Valinor suggests. "I'm afraid not, my lord," the guard says. "It appears as though the armory raiding party was let out by a secret passage." "Where?" the minister demands. "No one has been able to find it, my lord. We know only that the orcs are gone, but did not leave through the main entrance." Arendir's face grows grim. He turns to the Numenoreans. "My lords, I'm afraid this talk of alliance will have to be tabled for another time. Lord Gath, and you must stay, but the rest of you, and I'm once again sorry for having to do this to you all, must leave." Several of the elves and men look curiously on Arendir, but one by one they leave, beginning to discuss what this could mean and how an armory raid could be of such great importance. As they are speaking, the camera begins to zoom out and move away from the fortress. It begins to head east, and we get a beautiful look at the surrounding valley as it approaches the Anduin. It is at the river that we begin to zoom in on the remainder of the orc host. Leading them is Adar, who holds in his hand the black sword we saw a few episodes earlier. Our episode begins with Celebrimbor being let out of his room by one of Galadriel's guards. We can see that he's rather annoyed at this and demands to know why the High King saw fit to keep him under house arrest for over a week. The guard apologizes for the delay and explains that the High King has been calming the city and disentangling all the problems Elendil and the Smiths have created. Celebrimbor's look of anger fades and he bows his head. Have we really caused so many ills? How is this even possible? How could an envoy from Valinor itself err on so many grave points? That is a question we have been asking as well, but the High King has stated that all shall be answered today, and he has specifically requested the attendance of your guild. We next see a gathering crowd in the main courtyard of the city, where Gil-galad is standing before the people on a slightly raised platform. It is clear that the crowds before him are in a state of confusion. The Smiths, with Celebrimbor as their head, are standing behind him to his right, while Galadriel, Celeborn, Celebrian, and Elrond stand to his left. My fellow elves, Gil-galad begins. As you are all aware, there has been an elf here claiming to be an envoy from Valinor. His message was of the fating of the world, of the corruption, so heavily seeped into the very heart of Arda itself, that if we did not act without delay, and without prudence, we would all be destroyed. I tell you now that this elf was a liar and a fraud. I will tell you first how I came to know him to be a liar. When this Elendil came to Mithlond almost 10 months ago, he used the great tree of Linden as his example, for even it was decaying, despite being the heart of a land so long blessed by the presence of the High Elves. In my foolishness, I considered this to be the only proof necessary to trust the words of the envoy. I was perplexed, then, that the decay should come so quickly, and go so unnoticed until it was pointed out. It was then that my suspicions of this envoy began to kindle, and grew ever greater as I noticed that the tree seemed to stabilize and recover, the green returning to its leaves and the rich life of its roots continuing to expand. I therefore launched my own investigation into this corruption. I examined the forests of the world, the animals, and the lives of the men and elves who lived within Lindon and the surrounding lands. I can say now, with certainty, that there is a fading within this world, one which, in the end, will destroy all that we love in Middle-earth. At first glance, this would appear to justify rather than refute the words of the envoy, but this too would be foolishness. For the essential difference of the envoy's message, which distinguished his words from the discoveries which we ourselves had been making, was of the imminence of this destruction, the quickness of this fading, not the mere fact of fading itself. To my estimations, however, the true devastation implied by this Elendil would not come to pass for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. Still, I thought, he was a messenger of the Valar. Manwë has far higher thought, and Mandos greater foresight than I. But the example of the great tree stood ever in my mind, and when I returned, I found that it had healed completely. No, something was amiss. I sent a message to Galadriel and Celeborn, warning them of the envoy and explaining all that I had learned, and I made plans to ride here as soon as I could. Then, while I was making my way here, one of the eagles of Manwë came to me. He regretted to inform me that their envoy had become lost by tricks of the enemy, and had gone far to the south by mistake. When I heard this, I felt a dread like no other set upon me. I said to the messenger that we had thought the envoy had come almost a year prior, and he became overwhelmed with concern, and asked me to describe this Elendil. When I did, the eagle proclaimed that this was not their envoy, but an impostor. I therefore rushed to the city with all haste, hoping both that the lord and lady had received my message, and that I would not be too late to quell whatever devilry the false messenger had brewed. He pauses and turns to the smiths. It seems that I was almost too late. The smiths accept the rebuke reluctantly, with the exception of Celebrimbor, who looks devastated by the news. He immediately goes over to Galadriel and reconciles with her, kneeling before her and repenting of his actions. Galadriel raises him to his feet and embraces him, noting that she truly believes that from now on he shall see through such deceptions. Once he is done speaking, we see Gil-galad collect Elrond and retreat into the palace. At first, everything seems to be reconciled, with the smiths each apologizing to Galadriel and Celeborn in turn, and the people of Ostendethil relieved to find a resolution to the rebellion. As they are apologizing, however, Galadriel notices that many of the smiths still bear suspicion in their hearts. They eye her and Celeborn, as if waiting to hear what terms and conditions they will soon voice to the High King. Galadriel looks at them and her face begins to sadden. She turns to the side to speak to Celeborn quietly. Unfortunately, it appears that not even the High King can remove all stain of lies from the hearts of elves. What do you mean, my love? Whether by our fault or not, the trust between us and the smiths has been broken. Celeborn looks at his wife curiously. Are you sure of this? Celebrimbor seemed genuine in his— My love, Galadriel interjects. Look at them. Their respect for the High King has shocked them out of their foolishness, but one does not go from months of suspicion and hatred to acceptance and loyalty after a morning rebuke. She turns back to the smiths. I fear that they shall continue to be suspicious of our every word and action for years to come. It is still there in their eyes, though now buried under a layer of clarity. She pauses as her back straightens, and she seems to come to a realization. There's something more about this Elendil. She storms off, and Celeborn, confused, runs after her. In our next scene, we see the orcs gathering around a pedestal with an altar in the center, and the council of men and elves we saw several episodes ago standing around it. On top of the altar is tied a woman, likely taken in the siege or in another raid. She's struggling and attempting to free herself and to cry out through her bonds, which avails her nothing other than the amusement of the orcs. Adar approaches her with unusual solemnity, clothed in a dark gray cloak and holding within his hands a jet-black sheath. He hands the sheath to an elf wearing a bizarre, distorted mask. We see a shot of the woman looking up in utter terror, and then another with an elf pulling a black sword from the sheath, raising it into the air, and stabbing down towards the altar. At first, everything is still. Soon, however, a rumbling begins to grow throughout the land. The earth quakes, and what few trees are left are eradicated as the ground begins to crack all the way to a large mountain at the center of the land. As soon as the crack arrives, there's an explosive eruption, with gas and smoke venting out of the top, and we see in a shot at Adar that he is filled with both hope and fear at the sight. The council members begin to smile at the erupting mountain, only to have their enjoyment cut off. For the volcano almost immediately begins to slow down and once more becomes dormant after a minute or so. When all is quiet again, the orcs raise an uproar, and the council turns to Adar. "I thought you said that this would work," one of the men says. Adar steps closer to the body of the woman. "Clearly, she was not of great enough power. We're going to need someone of nobler lineage. Indeed, that is why I had requested that an elf be captured rather than some middling human." One of the elves turns to Adar and says, "You have berated many others on this council for anything not befitting our master's great plan. Now that you have failed in your task, you still wish to shift the blame to others. Perhaps we should join Khamu in reminding you that you are not our master, and we ought to put you to judgment just as you have done for others." Adar frowns at the suggestion, but still no fear appears in his eyes. He says nothing and lets the silence hang for a few moments. He then slowly approaches the elf, who begins to grow more worried with each step. "Are you meaning to imply that you would have succeeded against an ambush of Numenoreans? If so, that is certainly a remarkable feat, and I would gladly accept your offer to go fetch someone of noble blood to be used in our next sacrifice. I do not believe that was the task I was assigned." "Ah, good. So you will leave me to the true task, and keep the quibbling to yourself." Adar smiles. "Well, my friends, thankfully for you all, you shall not have to wait for too long." We immediately cut to Adar and a group of orcs walking into a prison chamber, although internally it doesn't appear to be much of a prison. It has stone walls and a locked door, but also windows, a set of comfortable-looking beds, and 3 men playing a game on the floor. They notice Adar as he walks into the room and immediately begin to look uncomfortable as they stand. "Milord," one of them says, "why have you come here? Have we failed in some way?" Another continues. Adar smiles slightly for a moment before saying, "What makes you think that you have failed?" "Well, my lord, when you came in, it was with a look of expectation, and we were under the impression that we had completed all of our Adar interrupts. "You actually thought that one mission would mean freedom and security for the rest of your days." The 3 men look to the floor and brace for some rebuke which does not come. Adar lets the silence hang. "Make no mistake. You will be spared and even kept from slavery, as promised. But only insofar as you persevere in your willingness to serve." The men look at each other, and Adar waits until they have finished processing what this means before continuing. "I need a man of noble birth. One of the elves or Numenoreans should work fine, but he must be alive and ideally unharmed by the time he arrives here. I will assist you in getting back to the fortress unseen, and I will help you get out, but I will not do anything else. Do you all understand?" "Yes, my lord. Though, what is a Numenorean again?" one of the men says, while the other 2 raise their eyebrows at him. Adar shakes his head. "Ah, yes, forgive me. I had forgotten your simple upbringing." He turns to the other 2. "You both are familiar with the term, are you not?" They nod. "Good. Very well, then. I wish you 3 and your companions luck. You will leave tonight, and I expect the kidnapping to be completed by the end of the month." He moves to leave the room before saying, "Oh, and please do remember what I've already demonstrated to you all. For your own good, of course." He exits. We then go back to Ost-in-Ethil, where we see Celebrimbor looking at the remaining rings with a troubled expression. There are several smiths around who do not yet seem aware of what has happened, until one of them eventually asks him what is the matter. He shakes his head and merely points to the pedestals with the missing rings. The smiths quickly realize what this means. "Someone has stolen them." "Yes, but who?" another elf says. "We must find them." Celebrimbor is silent as they continue to squabble over theories among themselves. Eventually he speaks. "I do not think Elendil has taken the rings." He turns around and sees a certain thinly suppressed suspicion in their eyes. Celebrimbor recognizes this almost immediately. "No, I don't think Galadriel or Celeborn had any part in it either. If Elendil wanted the rings, I see no reason he would not have taken them all, or what use he would have had with only 2 of them." As he is speaking, Narvi bursts through the doors of the guild. Celebrimbor! The smiths all turn to the dwarf, and Celebrimbor steps forward with a confused look on his face. Narvi runs up to him. I have bad news, and I'm afraid I must speak to you alone. Right now? Celebrimbor asks. Immediately, Narvi says with an urging glance at the other smiths. Celebrimbor looks around and they nod to him, each packing his things and leaving with relative haste. When they are alone, Celebrimbor looks as though he is about to say something, but Narvi cuts in before him. I stole one of the rings. It takes Celebrimbor several seconds to process the words. What? Why? How? When would you have done this? Narvi nods, as if this were the reaction he expected. My father was angered by how secretive you and the rest of the smiths were, and commanded me to find the project you had worked on and bring it to him. Then, with even more pain on his face, I snuck in through our secret entrance while the city was in a riot, though I didn't know the riot was going on. Celebrimbor says nothing. From his face, we can see that he is barely able to contain his hurt from being betrayed, his anger at losing one of the rings, and his fear about what this might cause. He stares at Narvi for a while. The dwarf simply maintains a bowed head and sorrowful expression, seemingly willing to accept whatever is coming. Eventually, Celebrimbor closes his eyes and his face softens, but not to a state of acceptance. I presume you have a reason for telling me this. Narvi looks up. Well, yes. My father has begun to act oddly. He's less free with his riches and more suspicious of others, and after a week of having to hear him judge oddly with the dwarves, I think it might be the ring I've given him that has caused all of this. He's never parted with it, as if it were the single largest chunk of mithril ever mined. Celebrimbor's eyes narrow, though not at Narvi. That could be a problem. He looks at the other rings. Celebrimbor, Narvi continues. I know it's not proper to ask for a favor from one whom I have just betrayed, but I need you to help me get the ring away from my father. Why are you not able to do it yourself? I've tried, but he refuses to listen to me. My only hope now is that he will listen to the master of the craft he bears, for if he does not, we would have to take it by force. Celebrimbor seems to think for a few moments before nodding. He smiles his first warm smile in the scene and adds, I suppose this is one way to return what you stole as well. In our next scene, we are watching Glorfindel travel with a group of Entwives. If you want, we can even have a map sequence like the ones in the show to demonstrate just how far the Entwives have taken them to the west. He should be about halfway between the Anduin and where the borders of Fangorn now stand, placing him in the middle of the wold. Of course, being the Second Age and the men of the area only recently having begun deforesting the land, he and the Entwives who are with him should be in a fairly dense forest of a similar look to Fangorn, though slightly younger than what we see in Lord of the Rings. Glorfindel is listening to the songs of the Entwives, and even humming along as he walks beside them, somehow tirelessly keeping pace despite his shorter legs. Occasionally, the look of peace he has from the songs breaks, and he peers behind himself, though no noise or any hint of them being followed shows itself to the audience. Eventually, one of the Entwives notices this and says to him, My dear, you must stop worrying about those poor men and halflings. Have you yourself not noted that your mission to the west is so much more important? In truth, Great One, Glorfindel says, I am not overly concerned with their safety anymore. I believe I was the one being pursued by this warlord in the first place. Ah, the Entwife says, half surprised. You fear they shall soon come after you. It is one of the thoughts on my mind, indeed. The Entwife pauses for a few seconds before continuing. I do not think you should fear them any more. We are now deep within the great forests where the husbands guard all living things, exactly as they stand. Indeed, I should not doubt if the trees you see around you are still alive from the elder days, and the whole forest, despite its disordered state, is likely being watched most closely by our kinsmen. Glorfindel looks at the Entwife with a questioning glance. You seem to begrudge the Entish method of guarding the forest. At first, the Entwife does not respond, though it's unclear if this is due to mere Entish thoughtfulness, or that she is taken aback by the comment. I would not say that I begrudge our kinsmen. It is only that their care of nature is so crude and disorganized. You saw our gardens, did you not? You no doubt noticed how wonderfully arranged each of the trees, bushes, and flowers were, how well kept they were from the smallest detail to the gardens as a whole. Whereas This forest. She pauses again and looks about her with mild distaste, though certainly not disgust. There are certain trees scattered about without any sense of order, weeds growing and choking out some of the most beautiful flowers. All the more disheartening since the husbands do not leave a space for them to grow. Glorfindel considers all this thoughtfully when, suddenly, he hears a snarl from behind him. He turns about in alarm and readies himself for an attack. The Entwife once more turns to him. "What is it, dear?" "I'm afraid that they are pursuing me, and if we do not part ways for a time, you would certainly be caught up in the fight. We have promised to be your guide, and we will continue to do so until you have found your way." The other Entwives nod at this. The 6 of them move into a fairly defensible position with their backs towards a stepped hill, not unlike the one that we read about in Lord of the Rings, the one that Merry and Pippin climb up when they first enter Fangorn, though obviously not the same one, considering how much further east this is. They begin to hear various noises, mostly snarling, but there are also the sounds of steel on steel. These sounds grow closer and closer until we hear the sound of a young girl screaming. Glorfindel immediately recognizes the voice and charges into the trees. In our next scene, we see Narvi and Celebrimbor entering Moria. Narvi is still embarrassed by his actions and forces all the dwarves around him to be extra courteous to Celebrimbor as they pass through. Eventually, Celebrimbor grows tired of this and stops the 2 of them. "My friend," he says, "I understand that this is your way of apologizing, but flattery is just as common in courtesy as gratitude or loyalty." Narvi turns away at the rebuke, but nods. "You're right. I suppose this is the natural reaction of a dwarf who has offended a friend. I must remind myself that you are no dwarf." Celebrimbor smiles at this. "Have I really made it so confusing?" Now Narvi smiles. "You have indeed. You have a nearly dwarvish obsession with crafts, and a mind for metal the likes of which I have never seen in an elf before, even among your fellow smiths. Although," he pauses. "Yes?" Celebrimbor urges him to continue. "Well, you do have something that is particularly undwarvish about you, though I'm not sure if this is because you are an elf or because you are yourself." As he says this, they approach the royal hall of Dwardelf, and Narvi leads Celebrimbor in to see King Durin. There they find King Durin giving judgments over a group of families about some dispute over newly discovered diamonds. Durin then resolves the dispute by assuming the diamonds for himself, reasoning that this is the most efficient way to prevent any bloodshed. "I will not have any of Durin's folk kill each other over jewels," he announces. Narvi and Celebrimbor look at each other with a questioning glance, but still, they present themselves to the king when their time arrives. "My son!" Durin exclaims in surprise upon recognizing Celebrimbor. "Why have you brought the elf to me?" "King Durin," Celebrimbor says, bowing before him, "do not fear. I hold no grudge towards you. I see now that we were deceived by a false envoy, and that we should have maintained more open relations with you about all of our projects. Still, I am afraid that I must ask you to return the ring that you have taken from us. These are objects of great power, as I'm sure you now realize, having wielded it for yourself, and we have discovered that they are likely perilous to those who wield them." Celebrimbor remains bowed for several moments before looking up at the king again to see why he has not responded. Celebrimbor is confused to see that the king does not appear to be thinking or ignoring Celebrimbor, but merely sitting there. He turns back to Narvi, on whose face is written the anxiety of your fear coming to pass. He therefore, not knowing what else to do, begins to repeat his request. "King Durin—" "No," Durin says, interrupting. "I will not relinquish my ring to you. Instead, I will keep it as a guarantee of your cooperation, a memorial of what happens when you do not pay proper respect to the dwarves." Celebrimbor frowns, but stands up, bows, and goes away with Narvi. "What now?" Celebrimbor says. "I was hoping you would have an idea for that." Celebrimbor looks at Narvi curiously. "What makes you think that I would know what to do in this situation? Our only options for retrieving the ring are asking for it or taking it by force." He looks at one of the dwarvish guards. "And I do not think the latter would be wise." "Very well, let us report this to your High King. We have seldom met, but even to me his wisdom has been well shown." We then see the 3 spies, which we saw earlier, re-entering the Numenorean fortress along with a scouting company. We see that they specifically avoid the elves, but go quickly to their co-conspirators and explain the plan. One of them explains the mission and the general plan. Another explains their thoughts on the method of execution. While they're in this conversation, they begin to question whether what they've done is a good thing, and one of them even suggests turning themselves in. "We are in the middle of the fortress right now. The orcs can't get at us, and a new alliance was just sealed between us and the seamen. Yarin. This is the best chance we have to put this behind us and be free of the orcs. Yarin, one of the spies says, we opened the gates during a battle. It turns out that they were going to win. You were the one who told the orcs who Lord Gath would value most, and several of us led the orcs to the armory. Do you really think they'll forgive us after all that? Besides, you've seen just how powerful the orcs are. They've been massing more and more with each passing day, and many of the kingdoms in the east are forging alliances with them. Even if the Numenoreans do help us, what can they do against so many? Another spy nods. You saw that army the orcs used to siege the fortress? That was only a tiny portion of their force, no bigger than a fingernail as to the rest of the body. Sure, they didn't take the fortress this time, but what would happen if they sent out their entire army? We'd be done for. Yarin shakes his head. Oh, all right, he sighs. Let's just get this over with. One of the spies who had remained in the fortress goes about dressed as a guard, showing that he has deeply ingratiated himself to the Numenoreans in the time since the battle. He approaches the chamber of the Numenoreans and finds Minister there reading a scroll. My Lord Minister, the spy says, if I am not mistaken, you were curious about the method of the orcs leaving the fortress, were you not? I was, Minister says, standing up. Have you discovered anything? Yes, in fact, I believe I may have found the passage. Then we must investigate at once, Minister exclaims. He calls over 3 of his guards, and the 4 of them follow the spy out of the building and towards the northeastern portion of the citadel. I have assembled a few of my fellow guardsmen to assist with the investigation, my lord. They are currently working on finding a way to get into the passage. Have you not found a way in? One of Minister's guards says. No, there appear to be numerous locks put in place. Fascinating, Minister says. In either case, I was hoping that they would be able to get to the inside by the time I was able to get you over here. Ah, here we are. They approach a section of the wall with what now appears to be an indication. Have you found a way in? Yes, we just closed the door again when you came in over the hill, one of the spies says. Then, with a weird system of knocks, the door begins to open. So, there seems to be some form of code attached to the door, Minister ponders. I wonder who would have built this sort of structure into the mountains. Did not Lord Arendir speak of the Dark Civilization? One of the guards says. Minister frowns. Let us not talk about that for now. Would you like to explore further, my lord? The spy says as he looks down the hallway. There may be orcs left, but since it's been so long since the battle, they should either be gone or dead by now, don't you think? Yes, let's go investigate, Minister says. He enters the tunnel, his guards follow, and the spies come in last. As they enter, one of the spies falls back and grabs one of his companions. Where's Yarin? He whispers. His companion's eyes dart towards the Numenoreans, and he quickly shakes his head, as if to say they shouldn't be talking about it with them around. He must have gotten lost. The original spy frowns but nods, and they continue to move down the hallway. In our next scene, we see Galadriel enter into the tower in which Varix and his people have been staying. She is flanked by 2 guards, with Celeborn noticeably absent as they practically sneak into the main hallway. She leads her guards silently towards Varix's room, which is guarded by someone. My lady, the guard says. Step aside, I have urgent business with the king. My lord has forbidden anyone from entering, even his closest advisors. Well, I'm sure you mean no harm, I simply cannot let you pass. Nonsense. Not only do I mean him no harm, I have reason to believe that he has been harmed already, and I am here to save him from his wound. The guard looks at her suspiciously. I don't believe I saw any wounds on his flesh when he came in. Galadriel shakes her head. It is just like a man to assume that because one's body is whole, he has not suffered any injury. As she says this, she strikes at the guard with a flash of movement and disarms and restrains him. One of her guards moves to take him. Make sure that he is unharmed, Galadriel says as he is taken away. She then turns and barges into the door. She finds, however, that no one is inside. She squints with suspicion and notices a trap door in the corner of the room. Just as she is about to go in, however, Celeborn comes into the room. I would have thought, he begins, that one so furious at Aulendil's intrusion into the space of our friends would have been more hesitant to imprison a guard. Galadriel turns to her husband. Is not cutting someone open considered to be either murder or medicine, based on whether it intends to kill or to heal? Regardless of whether I am successful, I fully intend to help Varix. Celeborn shakes his head. Help him with what, exactly? My love, this Aulendil seems to corrupt everything he touches. Did you not notice the change that had taken place amongst the men who live here after the Envoy's visit? Even if he merely spoke, I do not doubt that the words of this wicked sorcerer are enough to cast a spell of darkness upon this house. Celeborn sighs, but nods to his wife. Very well, let us proceed. The three of them venture down into the trapdoor and find another chamber full of books, various medical tools, and a great number of dead, sterilized bodies, both of men and orcs. There's a stone table in the center of the room covered with dried liquids of various colors. The atmosphere of the room makes one feel as though they have left reality and entered into a nightmare. And sitting in the middle of it all at a desk is Varix, clearly hard at work studying something and wearing a ring on his finger. "I thought I told you that I wasn't to be disturbed," Varix says in his native language. "You certainly have taken full advantage of the privacy I granted you," Galadriel replies in Sindarin, though it's unclear whether she is simply saying this or replying to his words with understanding. In either case, Varix's back straightens and he turns around, shocked and horrified to see Galadriel and Celeborn standing there. He looks over at the blood-soaked table and the dead bodies and then looks back at them. "Would you like to explain all of this?" Galadriel asks. Varix's face hardens, and he stands to face his guests, brandishing the ring on his finger. "Very well. Which would you like me to explain first? The stolen books, the corpses, or..." He looks at his finger. "This." "I am very surprised to find myself saying this," says Celeborn. "But given just how abhorrent everything else is in this room, I do not think I care much about the stolen books. What is the meaning of this room and these corpses?" "They're my victims," Varix admits. "My guards have been secretly taking the bodies of those wretched mountain orcs, and any man foolish or evil enough to align with them for months." "For months?" Galadriel says in horror as she looks once more at the corpses. "Why?" Varix smiles sadly. "I knew you wouldn't understand." "What do you intend to gain from this?" Varix speaks hesitantly, as if shameful of his actions, as he simply says, "Power." Galadriel glares at him. "Do you think that my people have been so free of troubles that we would not need power as well? What matters not is the power that you gain from this, but the evil and cruelty you bring upon yourself." She looks over, especially at the human bodies, and then looks back at Varix as she is about to continue talking, but Varix interrupts her. "Your people have troubles," he mocks. "You and your kinsmen are from the West, a land without troubles, in a constant state of bliss, drinking the finest wines which seem to sprout forth from the earth, and eating the fat of the land, from orchards the least of which would put the greatest forest in Middle-earth to shame." Galadriel's face hardens as she moves to deny this, but Varix continues. "My people have been pushed to the brink of destruction, saved only by my grandsire's willingness to acquire the strength of the earth against them. Without them, we wouldn't have survived." Celeborn shakes his head. "But we have saved your people from those troubles. Cannot now be the time when you put away these wicked deeds, now that you have no longer any need of them?" Varix laughs at this. "You know, for how wise you and your people are, my lord, I'm surprised at just how easily you can be fooled by a stranger's promise." Galadriel's face hardens further. "Stop speaking in riddles, Varix. What are you saying?" "You have little claim to the victory you had over the orcs. It was my power, which my father passed down to me, which destroyed the wall, which allowed you to defeat them, to make your mission successful." He looks directly into Galadriel's eyes, and, strangely, we see that for once in her life she is nearly matched in both resolve and power. The force of his stare startles her, but she refuses to back down. "Now that it comes to it, yes. I would like you to explain what you are doing with that ring. It is part of an agreement, I'm afraid." Celeborn raises an eyebrow and waits for Varix to continue. "Are you going to explain the agreement?" "I'm afraid not, though perhaps you will find out one day." The disgust and anger on Galadriel's face are almost immediately replaced with understanding, pity, and fear. "Varix," she says softly, "please, do not do that. The path you are going down is one which will destroy you or your people, or both. It seems that is going to happen one way or the other, but Annatar has given me a chance, and I am going to take it." "Enough of this," Celeborn says. "Varix, if you truly mean all this, I will have to imprison you." "Imprison a guest?" Elvish courtesy truly is fascinating. "Is it customary among your people to perform sacrifices in your host's house without his express permission?" Varix frowns and finally breaks eye contact with Galadriel and Celeborn before looking back up and saying, "Get out, all of you. We are leaving." Celeborn and their guard move to capture him, but Varix draws his sword and brandishes the ring once more. "Do you really want to bet on your own natural virtue against a weapon such as this? I promise you, I have the power to collapse the tower in an instant, and I will still come out alive. If you do not let me go, I will not only kill all of you, I will bring such a ruin upon this city that none will ever know it was here." "Do you think we would believe you after all that you have said?" says one of the guards, who has likewise drawn his sword. "Do you really want to wager it?" "Stop!" Galadriel commands the guard, never having broken eye contact with Varix. "Unfortunately, he is not lying, even if he is wrong." Celeborn straightens as his face grows graver, but moves to leave the room. Galadriel follows, and the guard as well soon after. "We will not forget this," Galadriel says. "I want you out of the city by nightfall." Varix nods. "In view of all you have done for me, I shall do as you ask." We then go back to Eminarnen, where we see Arondir patrolling the walls, likely waiting for another returning scouting party, and with occasional glances at the mountains to the east. Isilmo then comes up to him. "My lord," he says, "have you seen my son? He appears to have left unannounced." Arondir shakes his head. "I'm afraid not, though he may very well have passed me without my knowing it." "Your thoughts are likewise plagued with darkness." "Indeed." "What do you suppose they plan to do with the sword?" Arondir shakes his head once more, this time in bewilderment. "I simply do not know. I simply do not know. They could simply be looking to bring down the fortress. If that was their aim, they could have chosen a far less powerful weapon." He pauses. "I have dedicated all of our energies to find—" "My lord Arondir, my lord Isilmo!" yells a voice from off-screen. The camera pans, and we see Yarin come and bow. Arondir is startled by the seemingly drastic tone of the man's voice. "What is it?" At first, Yarin seems to hesitate, or be considering how exactly to say things, but then, suddenly, he simply bursts out saying, "I am a part of a group of 7 spies for the orcs, who were the reason for why the gates opened in the battle, as well as one of the men who let the orcs escape. We were convinced by their elvish overlords that the orcs would soon dominate us one way or the other, and that we ought to serve them and so live. My 6 companions now were ordered to capture a man of noble lineage. My 6 companions and I were ordered to capture a man of noble lineage and bring him back to Mordor. We chose Ministir, and my companions are currently leading him through the passage. There are orcs on the other side. They will capture Ministir and bring him to Mordor. My lords, I am terribly sorry, especially to you, Lord Isilmo, for your son is now in danger. I will submit myself to whatever judgment you think is worthy of my—" He looks up and pauses when he notices that Isilmo and Arondir have already left. Arondir has called together a group of elves and gotten their horses together so that they can sally out and hopefully catch the orcs, while Isilmo has called a few guards alongside Valinor and has gone back to the citadel to follow the trail. Yarin judges that he will be of most help to Isilmo, and so likewise heads back to the citadel. He arrives a few minutes after them and immediately opens the door to the passage and then goes within it. Meanwhile, the stone hallways at the beginning of the tunnel have given way to the Meanwhile, within the tunnel, the stone hallways have given way to caves as Ministir and his companions are slowly reaching the endpoint, creeping their way cautiously. "Sir," one of the spies says, "I know it is not right to make demands of the men of Westerness, but could we make greater haste?" Ministir pauses and turns to the man. "Your speech dignifies you. How did you become a man of no higher position than a guard?" The spy appears flustered by the question. Well, it is a long story, my lord, one that does not befit the circumstance." "Very well. I suppose, yes, we can make greater haste," and they begin to pick up the pace. We see them gradually make their way deeper, and they find the dead body of an orc who has fallen off one of the many cliffs in the tunnel. They continue to make their way until one of the spies points out another indent in the wall. "It appears to be the other end," one of Ministir's guards says. "Indeed," Ministir agrees. "Unfortunately, I'm not sure how—" As he is speaking, we hear the cry of Isilmo calling Ministir's name. Ministir calls out as well, and the spies stab his guards in the back and open the doorway to the outside. We see about 30 orcs there getting ready to attack. They quickly disarm and grab Ministir, while Isilmo, Valinor, and their guards charge into the orcs. They kill some of the spies, with Yarin joining the battle and sorrowfully accepting the death of his former companions. More orcs come to attack as the original set begin to make off with Ministir. Valinor, out of everyone, makes the most valiant effort to break through the orcs and chase after Ministir, but because of this effort, he fails to dodge an orc swipe towards his head, which ends up slashing through both of his eyes. Unable to fight any longer, he allows Isilmo to get him out of the battle. Arondir and his elves are seen coming around the bend of the mountains. They spot the orcs and charge into them, causing a rout, but by this time, Ministir and his orc captors are nowhere to be seen. "Elf!" Isilmo yells. "They took him! They took my son! Please, you must get him back!" Arondir is horrified at the news, promises to do so, and immediately leads his elves east. "What are you expecting us to do?" one of his companions says. "Whatever we have to. If we do not get that man back, a calamity the likes of which none of you have ever seen will descend upon this valley." They charge into the wilderness as another group of elves and men, led by Gath and Bronwyn, come to help reinforce. The elves are told the situation, and they quickly chase after Arondir to assist him in his mission, but Bronwyn immediately tends to the wounded Numenoreans, especially Valinor. In our next scene, we are in a forest, and in the early parts of the night. Wolves are howling all about, and the screams of little girls seem to haunt the trees. Then we see someone's foot swiftly pass the camera. The camera then follows, and we see Glorfindel running with an hitherto unseen swiftness through the forest as the full moon begins to send his silver light through the leaves. This, however, is largely unmatched by the golden glow which seems to rise from within Glorfindel's own body. Wargs occasionally see him, and some are even brave enough to attack, but these are quickly dispatched. He pursues the distant sight of a man dressed in a black cloak upon a horse, standing atop a hill with what appears to be a masked child guarded by orcs. The night continues to wear on as he runs, with the moon orbiting over him as he continues to work his way through the trees, but the hill always seems to be the same distance. Glorfindel, by his expression, appears either not to notice this or to be deliberately ignoring it. Orcs continue to attack, but each time Glorfindel rips off a bit of fur, sometimes easily and sometimes only with a great difficulty. By the time the sun begins to brighten the sky, he appears spent and exhausted. A new pack of wargs gathers around, and we hear Hamul's voice mocking Glorfindel. All that effort just to save a child. One no more powerful than a fledgling pup. The wargs all attack Glorfindel, but he quickly stabs 3 of them while the rest tear and bite to seemingly no effect. Hamul's voice seems confused by this, and Glorfindel looks the distant figure on the hill in the eye. A blazing fire seems to shine behind his own. Suddenly, as if the earth itself were moving, the hill in the distance seems to zoom forward until it's right in front of Glorfindel. The ineffective wargs disappear, as do the orcs. All that is left is Glorfindel, Hamul, and a few of his guards. "You could see through me the entire time?" Hamul exclaims. "Where is the girl?" Glorfindel says, calmly but firmly. "Or perhaps you wish to see the full extent of the power the Valar have entrusted to me. I can assure you, further hindering my path will only grant you the sorrowful pleasure of seeing what remainder of the light of the 2 trees, when provoked in wrath, can do to a man of evil." As he says this, the glow about him becomes more visible, despite the light of the sun, and indeed, seemingly because of the light of the sun. "Your illusions last only so long as none are able to open the blinds." He then charges at Hamul, drawing his sword to finally execute the criminal, only to find that when the blade pierces his armor, it does so too quickly and easily. He turns and sees that the image of Hamul has remained static, and the guards likewise remain where they are. Glorfindel closes his eyes and takes a deep breath. We then hear a great crash, like the shattering of glass, and when he opens his eyes, the images of Hamul and his guards have disappeared, though the land around is the same. More interestingly, however, there is no voice from Hamul, who appears to have fled from the scene. "A double illusion," Glorfindel mutters to himself. "I will not allow that to work on me again." He climbs to the top of the hill and begins searching the surrounding lands. It appears as though almost all the wargs have fled, but he can still sense an evil presence within the forest. More disturbingly, he looks to the east and sees in a vision a great dark cloud engulfing the whole land. He looks back to the west and sees a clear sky and bright light shining from over the mountains. Then, almost as suddenly as it came, the vision disappears, and he is presented with the plain look of the world again, the sun still rising in the east. Glorfindel looks up to the sky, and we see an eagle circling above him, though he does not appear to be looking at it. He nods his head, returns his gaze to the east, and charges back into the forest. We then see Gil-galad and Elrond consulting several elvish counselors who live throughout the realm of Region when Galadriel and Celeborn burst in and demand his attention. At first, Gil-galad is annoyed at their abrupt behavior, but as they explain the situation, he very quickly drops everything and attends to them. While they explain what happened with Varix and the other possible effects of Elendil and Eregion, Celebrimbor and Narvi enter into the palace as well, and recount what had happened to them with King Durin. Gil-galad is extremely disturbed by these reports. He takes a moment to consider things before concluding that those rings created under Elendil's guidance are either defective by design or by some flaw in the process. He asks Celebrimbor his opinion on the matter, to which Celebrimbor notes the many times that Elendil had ordered the processes of creating the rings to change from their natural course according to the ordinary rules of smithery to fit some new design. In some cases, this was done for the purpose of experiment with the lesser plain rings. In others, it was done to the great rings. "We had reasoned," he states, "that someone who had been under the direct tutelage of Allah himself was simply seeing things more clearly than we. But knowing what we do now," Gil-galad stands from his seat, "can the great rings heal the gradual corruption of which I spoke? They can. In fact, I have seen their effects myself, and, indeed, they can even, to a small degree, restore the world to its original virginity, though now they appear to also have a power to destroy. As Galadriel and Celeborn have pointed out, they can be used as weapons to amplify power just as much as they can be used as tools to save the world." Once more, Gil-galad thinks on this. "Do you think you can create more rings?" Celebrimbor is surprised by this question. What do you mean, High King? Clearly, the rings made under the guidance of this Annatar have a corrupting influence, one which acts far too quickly. They must therefore be locked up and kept away, especially from any mortal hands. We may still, however, attempt to bring good out of the evil council of Valinor. New rings made apart from his corrupting influence, Galadriel says as she realizes the thought process. She turns to Gil-galad, and without their ability to hurt? Gil-galad nods before turning back to Celebrimbor. Can it be done? It will be done, High King. Though we have exhausted our sources of fine metals. We shall have to go and gather more. Celebrimbor nods to Narvi as he says this, who nods back, and immediately the two of them leave to begin their work. Gil-galad appears to be frustrated as they leave. What is it, High King? Galadriel asks. This Annatar has created a seemingly endless wave of troubles through which I have had to sort. I know not what sort of creature he is, but although I have made some progress into understanding his motivations, in many ways he seems to have caused trouble at random. In any case, I am done here. Elrond, we are leaving. Yes, High King. Though, if I may request one final thing, I would like to have some time to ready myself and to say my goodbyes. Gil-galad gives his ambassador a knowing smile and nods. Elrond bows respectively and goes off to ready himself for departure. I also have a request for you, High King, Galadriel says. Go on. Despite the work you have done to reconcile the Smiths and myself, I fear that they shall not cooperate with any sort of royal power while we are here. Gil-galad sighs. Yes, I'm afraid that is another point of unraveling I have had to do, and I fear you may be right. The Smiths, it is clear, were so deeply and subtly taught to mistrust you and Celeborn, and to a lesser degree your daughter, that they can only speak of you with the greatest prejudice. What's worse, so cunning were the words that they can hardly recognize their own thoughts on the matter, and so speak of your tyrannies as if they were discussing the weather or the different flavors of wine. It is also clear, Galadriel continues when Gil-galad is finished speaking, that while Elendil did not suitably act as envoy to the Elvish kingdoms, these people need an envoy now more than ever, and the true envoy is still nowhere to be found. Therefore, I propose that my family acts as envoy at least to the people of Lorinand, that they may be warned and guarded against the destructive words of Elendil. Gil-galad looks surprised at the suggestion and turns away to look towards the east to the Misty Mountains. Celeborn, however, looks disturbed at the suggestion. That would take us either through the pass of Carathras, or into that dwarvish kingdom. I was hoping to receive safe passage through Moria, yes. That seems to be the best option. Celeborn shakes his head violently. I will not tolerate it. Galadriel steps back in surprise at the vehemence of his statement. My love, be reasonable. I will not allow myself to go through a dwarvish realm, and I fail to see why you would dare to do so. What if they were to kill you and our dear Celebrian? You know what the dwarves are like. Indeed, the dwarves of Khazad-dûm are kind and courteous to all who deal fairly and justly with them. Celeborn, the High King says, I do think you are being most unjust about this. Durin's folk are not the people who laid waste to Doriath, and to attribute to them the sins of their kinsmen would be no different than if you were punished for the crimes of Feanor and his sons. Celeborn wavers for a moment before once more reaffirming his resolution not to go through Moria and storming off into his chambers. Galadriel looks expectantly at the High King, who then says, I think your suggestion is very wise, Galadriel. I will arrange an honor guard of loyal and dedicated guardsmen and servants to help you on your way, as well as envoys of my own to assist you in helping the people of Lorinand. In fact, he looks in the direction where Elrond had left. I think news of the dangers of this situation ought to be spread far and wide. And finally, for our last scene, we watch the journey of Arondir and his elvish companions as they make their way up the hillsides of the Efel Duath, eventually coming to the pass of what would one day be Minas Morgul. They are clearly in a hurry, but harried severely by their lack of resources or planning, mostly making their way by foraging, only to find that they simply cannot track down the orcs. Once they make their way through the pass, they feel the earth begin to shake. Arondir in particular seems concerned by this, but they continue their journey and come to see the whole face of the plain of Gorgoroth. There are few houses and even fewer trees, as massive trenches, holes, and forges are scattered about the land, though strangely no orcs seem to be about. The earth quakes once more as cracks go up in every direction, and as if having a premonition of what is about to happen, Arondir tells everyone to find cover. The cracks once more make their way to the mountain at the center, but this time, instead of a violent eruption which peters out, the mountain sends forth a surge of ash both across the ground and through the air. It continues its eruption as the elves recover and regroup from the main shock, as Arondir looks down upon the Gorgoroth to see the untold number of orcs and men coming out of their shelters as darkness covers the face of the land, this time permanently. Arendir looks at his companions and shakes his head sorrowfully, with tears coming into his eyes. He pauses for a moment, before eventually walking back down the mountains, leading his men back to Eminarnin. At one point, one of his companions asks what is going on, and he is only able to utter one thing. We lost. And with that, the screen fades to black. Our final episode opens up with a view of the new Mordor. The ash and gas have all settled, and the land looks in some ways similar to what we see in The Lord of the Rings, though the Great Tower of Barad-dûr is still not yet finished. A great horn is blown in the north, and all the orcs and some of the men have looks of fear and excitement upon their faces as they rush to the Valley of Udun. There, they and the council greet with the proper pomp and circumstance the arrival of Aulentiel, the glow of his body gone and some of the finer, more obtrusively flattering characteristics repressed, for a harder, more commanding form. My lord Sauron, one of the counselors says, the preparations are almost complete. You must forgive us, for we had not expected you to come so soon. We presume that all went well with you? Sauron smiles. Yes, very well indeed. His voice should be one of great power, though not necessarily deep, violent, or expressed merely in the amplitude of the sound. I couldn't think of a good way to do it within the context of this video, so use your imagination. Though, we will have to work quickly. The elves will likely soon be alerted to our presence here, but I believe I have created a way to remove them as a threat. Where is that elf, the one my orcs call Adar? The other counselors smile. We are afraid he cannot be with us any longer, but we will no doubt explain more fully once you have been able to rest from your long journey within your tower. Very well. Sauron then turns to the orcs. His voice, though not spoken very loudly, seems to echo across the entire valley. My servants, you all have work to do before we are ready for the fight that is coming. This land is to be turned into the great fortress of our new empire, the Empire of the Orc. Go now, and ready the forges, for when we have struck our blow, you shall be free of the tyranny of men. The orcs cheer at this. Dwarves, another cheer. And most of all, the elves, the loudest cheer of all. The orcs continue to cheer until they disperse as Sauron is led back to his tower. As this happens, one of the counselors seems to notice something in the distance, but is recalled by Sauron and draws his attention away from it. A panning shot over the entire land shows the tunnels, trenches, forges, towers, bridges, and all sorts of war machines being built as the camera moves back west over the mountains, and we get a good look of just how far the ash has extended over the South Anduin Valley until we see Arendir and his companions returning to the fortress of Eminarnin. They ride into the fortress and are greeted solemnly by the elves and men there. Arendir requests to be taken to Isilmo and Valinor. They are brought into the citadel, and Isilmo rises hopefully upon seeing Arendir, but is quickly taken by despair when he notices the look of apologetic sorrow on Arendir's face. Arendir first comes to Isilmo and bows. My lord, I am afraid I have failed you completely. I can offer no justification besides my own lack of skill in finding a pass into the land to the east. I'm sorry. Isilmo does not respond, fighting to keep tears from welling up in his eyes. Instead, he simply leaves the room to retreat into his chambers. What's going to happen to us? One of the men in the room says. Arendir looks around and notices that no one seems confused by the question. Everything was explained to us, one of the other men says. Lord Gath believed that now that the traitors were revealed and the sword gone, it would be safe for most of us to know what was taken and why. I see, Arendir says. Thankfully, it appears that nothing shall happen for the time being. Everyone looks confused at this. Did you not all feel the earthquakes? They happened only a week or so ago. We did, Valinor says, eyes still bandaged, though there are no longer any bloodstains. But since nothing came of it, we assumed it was merely natural. I'm afraid not, my lord. The sword of which I spoke was used to create permanent darkness over Mordor, and spread that darkness throughout the surrounding lands. I do not expect that we should be able to stay here any longer. We must retreat further across the river and seek a new place to hold out. And if I may be so bold, Lord Valinor, despite your loss and my failure, I beg that you do not abandon us to our fate in this land, for if you do, we shall surely be conquered. Valinor nods. You do not need to worry about whether we shall uphold our vows to you, my friend. The people of Numenor do not easily abandon allies, assuming they have not been betrayed. The men who have done this to us have either been punished or killed. We must now seek vengeance against the orcs. He stands. Still, the few of us here cannot withstand the onslaught you say is coming. My cousin and I shall have to go back to Numenor and seek reinforcements. Indeed, I doubt the Queen will be able to tolerate non-intervention once she sees the loss of her nephew and the state of our party. He walks out of the room. Shortly afterwards, Lord Gath and Bronwyn enter the room. My Lord Arondir, I heard you have returned. We have a dire report. As I'm sure you must have seen, there are black clouds coming from Mordor. What has happened? Arondir, somehow coming to an even greater understanding of what has happened, turns to the Lords of the Valley and says, My lords, I am sorry. I have lost. He sulks away, back bent and eyes fixed firmly on the ground. After leaving, Gath looks around and sees that everyone is now looking to him. His face bears a grim expression, but he hides that for a moment, and his more stoic temperament reasserts itself. Clearly our commander is overwhelmed for the moment, but this is no time for us to follow him. Let us retreat and reestablish ourselves to fight another day. He leaves the room with Bronwyn. The camera then pans north, and we see that Glorfindel has already made his way back to the Falls of Raros. He looks south with disturbed urgency at the sight of the new ash and black clouds looming over the hills of Mordor. He quickly crosses the river, the light within him almost constantly visible at this point, and makes his way over the paths of Emenwyl. We then see a great forest, in which is a path on which rides a large group of elves on horseback, being led by Elrond and Gil-galad. They are mostly silent save for the sounds of the horse hooves on the earth and stone, with the ambient sounds of the forest during late springtime bustling about them. Still, it is clear from their faces that their minds are not idle. Indeed, they all seem to be in the middle of some horrible thought process, for their faces are grim. Eventually, however, Elrond awakens from his thoughts and turns to the High King. Have you come any closer to an answer to this riddle, High King? I am afraid not, my friend, Gil-galad responds. It is clear that this Annatar was making some form of preparation, intending both to deceive us himself and prevent us from learning the will of the Valar. If only we could find the true envoy they have sent. I have been wondering, Elrond says, whether this Elendil was even truly an elf, or if he were a spirit of higher power. That is indeed a possibility we cannot dismiss. It is as Galadriel said. Something was different about him. He had power over the hearts and minds of elves in a way that not even she could match. He ponders his own words for a moment before stopping the group and turning to look back at the Misty Mountains. Gildor, when was the last time we have received news from our distant brethren in the south? I believe that would be 2 years ago, High King, Gildor says. They mentioned vague reports of growing towns, house squabbles between rising noble families, and a growing number of orc raids. Gil-galad nods and turns to continue going back to Lindon. I do not know exactly what this Lord of Gifts has been planning, but it is now clear to me that we have spent far too much time attempting to secure Eriador. They come around the bend of the hill and we see the Blue Mountains and the outskirts of Lindon in the distance. I now have no doubt that he has been building power in the east or south, somewhere out of our reach. Elrond nods in agreement. Galadriel's decision, it seems, was a wise one, though I fear what evil Celeborn's stubbornness may cause. We shall have to deal with that when the problem arises. For now, I'm afraid we shall have to make preparations for war. We then go to a shot of Celebrimbor and Narvi approaching the throne of Durin with Galadriel and Celebrian behind them. Out of courtesy, Narvi insists that the two ladies go before them in their request. Galadriel accepts this courtesy and presents herself to King Durin. She is bedecked with traveling clothes which are humble, though by no means impoverished in color and style. Still, being Galadriel, she wears them with unblemished grace, elegance, and elvish beauty, such that a man, or in this case a dwarf, would hardly have been able to notice. Having only heard her speak among elves the entire season, we are, in this scene, confronted with the unbridled brilliance of her voice when it is spoken in the slightly less couth, though by no means ignoble, halls of the dwarves. King Durin, she begins while doing a reverent curtsy. I want to say first of all that I have no part in any disputes you have had with members of my kingdom, and, indeed, am as much a victim of them as you have been. It is in light of this that I must ask for safe passage to the other side of your realm, to meet the elves who live in the land of Lorinund. The king rises from his throne and begins to move towards his petitioner. As he does so, he speaks fairly softly compared to what we are used to. Could you be more specific about your intention in the lands to the east? You are familiar with the great enemy, are you not? The one destroyed long ago by Allay and his companions? Indeed. I am. Durin continues approaching her. I have reason to believe that, though we may be free of his wickedness, not all traces of him have been banished from Middle-earth. There are lingering followers of the great enemy, and one of these has posed as an envoy from the Valar. Indeed, from Allay in particular. Durin looks at Narvi and Celebrimbor behind her. I see. I would like to warn the elves to the east. They deserve to know what is coming. King Durin then arrives in front of Galadriel. The two of them stand for a few moments as Galadriel demonstrates her intentions to him with the casual confidence of her face. The king bows low before her. My lady, you and your companion shall have leave to go through the roads of my kingdom for as long as I am king. Go now with my blessing. Galadriel smiles graciously and bows to the king, placing a kiss of gratitude upon his forehead and calling to her entourage. As they leave, Narvi and Celebrimbor look to each other hopefully and move to approach the king. They have several carts with them, and once more Celebrimbor bows low before Durin. King Durin, your son and I have discovered that there is a great opportunity for a new venture between our people. In light of our recent mistakes, I would like once more to apologize on behalf of all the Noldor and Eregion. Furthermore, as a peace offering and in hopes that trade may once more be opened between our peoples, I have brought forth our customary settlement. The king raises an eyebrow. Already? I'm impressed by your courtesy. Celebrimbor acknowledges the statement only mildly before continuing. I've brought with me 3,000 bushels of wheat from our fields, 2,000 barrels of wine, marked according to our recognized custom, as well as a third of the produce of our vineyards and gardens for this summer. Finally, I have heard among your people that material for clothes and furniture are greatly needed from beyond the mountains. Therefore, as a show of goodwill, I have brought twice our normally agreed quantity in such resources. I ask only, as before, that we be allowed to continue trade, especially with the metals of mithril and gold, which have so mutually enriched our peoples. The king looks at the food, clothes, and other goods with the look of fascinated temptation. Narvi and Celebrimbor look to each other with a smile and a nod. The king, however, looks as though a strange hesitance has come over him. No. He pauses, and then, as if scrambling for an excuse, he continues, It is clear to me that we can no longer give away so valuable a resource as mithril. Celebrimbor is in shock. Narvi, however, bursts out in anger. Father, what madness is this? You know well that this is by far the greatest trade we have ever made. The elves are being more than generous with us, being free with necessities while we are miserly with metals. Do you not see that you've been overtaken by a strange greed, that before I gave you that ring you were far more Enough! The king shouts, his voice echoing through the halls. For a time everyone is silent, and the surrounding dwarves look at him in fear. Guards, the king continues, escort this elf out of my realm. He is banished. What? Narvi roars in response. I will talk to you later, the king says to Narvi. While he says this, several dwarvish guards approach Celebrimbor apprehensively, ready to draw their weapons in case the elf does something. Instead, Celebrimbor simply bows to the king and signals to his elvish companions to retake the goods. We then cut to a shot of the large valley leading up to the fortress we saw in episode 1. The fortress appears very different, repaired, and even somewhat decorated, with the beginnings of a town outside of it. We then see Varix on horseback, with the rest of his entourage, ring in hand, with a look which mixes sorrow, frustration, resolution, and even a bit of hope. The rest of the men and women with him appear worried, but are also too afraid to say anything, and give off the impression that this was an extremely silent ride home. Varix does, however, speak up as they continue down the slope into the valley. Did I make the right decision? The servants look at each other, with Eirik being the only one willing to answer. Ultimately, my king, I do not believe that is for us to decide. Varix turns to him and smiles slightly. Meaning that it is for me to decide whether or not I have done well? Eirik tries to fight his own smile. No, I mean that we never got the chance to learn ethics from the elves. Varix chuckles grimly. Indeed. He looks back to the fortress. It seems there is much we could have learned had we stayed. Eirik does not respond, so eventually Varix continues. I suppose there's no use regretting the past. Besides, with this, he holds up the ring,
we shall truly be able to fulfill the High King's desire for us. Eric looks as though he's about to say something, but refrains from doing so. Instead, Varix begins to laugh excitedly, and everyone around him looks confused. "What is it, my king?" one of the other servants says. "Don't you all understand? Our war is over. We have a realm of our own, and now I have the power to prevent any invasion of orcs till the world ends. We've won. I've secured our kingdom's freedom forever." Slowly, it seems to dawn on everyone just what all this means, and a look of hope kindles in their faces. Apart from Eric, who still appears solemn as they make their way to the fortress.
We then see a shot of Marigold in her imprisonment, being taken further and further east by a group of Easterling men. She is strangely humming a tune of happy idlement as they take her along the way, clearly to the annoyance of her captors. They motion for her to stop, but she persists. One of them, a calm, collected soldier, moves over and slaps her across the face. She stops humming for a second in shock at the slap, but then begins to hum again. Immediately, the soldier slaps her again and says something to the other soldiers. They begin marching again, and the calm soldier walks next to the soldier dragging Marigold's chains. After what appears to be a few minutes, Marigold begins humming again, and the soldier slaps her once more. After a few more minutes, she repeats the process. "Why do you do this?" one of her fellow captives says to her. "I find it helps me keep my mind cheerful," she replies, and begins to hum her tune once again. The guard strikes her once more. "Besides," she whispers back after being struck, "they'll barely notice the mumbling of your friends while paying attention to me." She hums again, and the man looks around and notices that several of his companions are communicating discreetly to each other, not solely by whispers, but also by signs, which the disguise of the humming renders invisible to the Easterlings. The captured man is surprised to see this, but nods. He looks around and is happy to see that several of his companions seem to be already in the middle of forging a plan. Marigold is once more struck, this time more severely, to the point that blood is drawn, but she continues to hum her tune, and even seems to increase in volume. The soldier waits a few moments and slaps her again, this time even more harshly. Marigold has no reaction. At long last, the soldier seems to have grown frustrated. He takes her by the shoulder and turns her body towards his, making motion to pummel her to the ground. Before he can do this, however, his hand is caught by a fellow soldier. Marigold starts, more shocked by this than she was by the blows, and watches as the two soldiers begin arguing. Not letting the opportunity slip, several of the other prisoners begin speaking to each other more quickly, and Marigold catches wind of their plan. Suddenly, however, the marching stops, and the two soldiers cease arguing. It is clear that the soldier who stopped Marigold's abuser is of some higher command, for he seems to order the other away. It is at this point that the sun sets, and a camp is set up. The friendly Easterling looks at Marigold. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Marigold says nothing, but stares at him with a questioning glance. The Easterling commander, after waiting for her response, says nothing. He then brings the chieftain of her fellow prisoners to him as well, and begins talking to both of them. "I'll grant that humming is annoying, and that it drew away some of the attention, but did you really think that no one was watching your fellow prisoners?" He turns to the chieftain. "I will admit that I admire your resilience, but you lack any real sense of secrecy." Marigold still makes no response. Neither does the chieftain. The Easterling commander rolls his eyes and grabs them by the shoulders, roughly taking them out of the light of the fires now that the sun is set. "Pretending as though you don't understand me is useless. I and others have already heard you using the same language." Marigold, whether out of stubbornness or lacking anything to say, continues her silence. The Easterling seems to be considering something before turning to the chieftain and speaking in a language that Marigold does not understand. The chieftain responds somewhat haltingly, but the Easterling seems satisfied. He brings them close to a tent, though they remain shrouded in darkness, and they hear people arguing within. To Marigold, this all means nothing, but the chieftain seems to understand and become horror-struck. He turns to Marigold and says, "He's not lying, little girl," but then says to the Easterling, "Why do you tell me this? What could you hope to gain from helping us in this way?" The Easterling smiles. "I have no more love for any of this cruelty. No part of my clan does." He turns to Marigold. "The High Chief Khamul is luring that elf into a trap. You are the centerpiece of that trap." Marigold's eyes widen and she finally responds. "What's he going to do?" "The High Chief has received some help from an evil creature, which has granted him the ability to... well... I'll admit I don't know precisely what he can do. From what I know, he has already tested them on this elf and been satisfied with them. Once the elf comes, there will be no one doing things for him, which was why I must get you all to safety first." Marigold stares at him dumbfounded for a moment, but only a moment. After that is over, her face hardens with determination. "How can I help?"
The Easterling gives the chieftain and her a cloak. I have obtained permission to grant you all cloaks and blankets. We are in the middle of winter after all, and tonight my men will supply you all with weapons. There are 12 of us. He designates each of them in a subtle way so as not to arouse suspicion. I and 2 of my men have the watch tonight. We will kill the other watchers, free you from your bonds, and then, when I give the signal, you will help us destroy the camp. He then turns to Marigold. You are the one the elf seems to value most, based on what the High Chief says. A shameful blush spreads across the Harfoot's face. Furthermore, he has paid far more attention to you than you realize. I've already received the impression from him that you are hard-headed, foolhardy, short-sighted, and driven by impulse rather than thought. Marigold's blush deepens. Therefore, I advise you to escape and find him if you can. It is possible that the Easterling meant no offense by the words, but his tone was that of a straightforward man used to command. Marigold seems annoyed by this, but nods. Very hesitantly. In our next scene, we see Valinor and Isilmo sailing west. The Numenorean ship is silent, though it is clear that the voyage has been ongoing for at least several days at this point. Valinor is sitting below deck, while Isilmo seems to be doing all that he can to keep himself from confronting the loss of his son. Eventually, however, he goes down below deck to where Valinor is laying. At first, Isilmo believes his cousin to be asleep before Valinor says, "Is that you?" Isilmo frowns. "Yes. How are you dealing with your loss?" "I could justly ask you the same question," Isilmo says. Valinor sits up from the bed. "I'm not going to start an argument about this. If you would like to save discussing it for some other time, I will be happy to do so." Isilmo's frown deepens, but the rest of his face softens. There's a long pause as Valinor, his eyes no longer bandaged, stares in the direction of his cousin with 2 gaping holes in his face, a look which is especially disturbing in the low light. Still, Isilmo eventually moves over and sits next to him, taking no account of the awful sight. "I cannot talk," he says after making a motion to say something. His eyes begin to glisten as he holds back the welling tears. "Cousin, my mind has finally numbed from the pain, and it has done so only because I have commanded all who are on this ship to remain silent. Even now, with the mere suggestion of loss on your lips, I can already feel the pain returning. That dark, despairing abyss which hitherto I had never felt. No, I cannot talk about this. Not now, and I fear not ever. I do not believe that will be possible. The Queen will expect a full report, and I do not know how I shall spin the tale of how I lost my eyes without mentioning the loss of your son. If you do not wish to talk now, we may save it for later in the voyage, but based on how long we've been at sea, I do not think we have much voyage left." Isilmo closes his eyes and attempts to relax unsuccessfully as he takes a long, deep breath. Valinor senses something in his cousin. "I see that you are not only grieving, but also troubled. Why?" Isilmo shakes his head. Then, in a falsely calm voice, he says, "How is one supposed to deal with the loss of his only son? And what will this mean for the future of Numenor? How is one to continue living knowing that you could have prevented his death if you only turned around and went home? You and I both know that was not an option. Even Minister came to see that in the end." Isilmo shakes his head. "That was always an option. Cousin, we saved thousands of men and elves by our expedition. They shall die all the same, now that a dark power once more grows in the east. Even if we do prevail against them, what are their lives in comparison with my son?" He immediately shows regret for having said these words out loud, and at last his sorrow overtakes his face. At first, Valinor says nothing. Eventually, he puts his hand on his cousin's shoulder. "Do you remember my mother?" Isilmo looks up. "Yes. Why?" "I remember very little of her. I have no image of her within the court, or in any of her fine dresses at the festivals in Armenalas, or part in the Meneltarma. No. I only remember her as she was when I laid upon her lap as a child, and when she lay dying of sickness." Isilmo bows his head. Valinor continues. "What always struck me as most strange is that her face showed the opposite expression of what you would expect. While she played with me and my siblings, she looked troubled, as if constantly worried about the future, suffering in both mind and body. But when she laid on her bed, her body suffering immense pain, she had the face of one wholly content, bright with joy, and full of love and hope shining upon all who entered her room. Isilmo says nothing. One day, I don't remember if this was before or after she became sick, for I cannot remember her face as she said this. She asked me if I had done my duty to my tutors, as well as to your side of the family. Here Valindiel's smile widens. I do not know the reason, but I was feeling rather mischievous that day, for instead of answering her, I asked, "Why should I?" She replied that life is all about fulfilling duties, for it is only in service to others that one obtains happiness. Again, Isilmo says nothing. I did not know what to say, for it seemed to me that her service to others had brought no happiness to her life. Eventually I asked if she had lived in service to others. I have certainly tried, she said. Thinking I had won, I retorted that her life brought her nothing but sorrow. Valindiel pauses as Isilmo continues to listen. I can still feel the smile on her face when I said that, Isilmo. Her face is gone, but the warm embrace of her smile is there. Do you know what she told me? She said, "My dearest son, don't you understand? Sorrow and joy do not exclude each other. It is only through sorrow that one can obtain joy that is eternal, and know that one has gotten it." Valindiel stops speaking, and Isilmo continues to stare at him. Eventually he looks away, tears still streaming from his eyes. He closes them and shakes his head. I cannot imagine the sorrow ever becoming joy. Valindiel nods. Neither can I. But her words have rung out in my head ever since. I do not know if this is true, but I think they are the reason I have tried to become a better man all these years. There is once again a pause as the two cousins seem to be content to listen to the waves and the creaking of the hull. Eventually, Isilmo stands up, and Valindiel does so as well. Valindiel, Isilmo says, helping his cousin to the stairs. He hesitates to continue. You have always been a much better man than I, and throughout the years, you have only continued to advance far ahead of me. Valindiel waits for his cousin to continue, but Isilmo says nothing. The two of them begin walking up the stairs. After coming up on deck, they find the crew just as silent as before, each man attending to his own thoughts. This silence lasts a while as Valindiel appreciates the feel of the wind in his hair and the smell of the sea in his nostrils, and eventually we hear a general sigh of relief arise among the crew, and we see that they are looking with excitement towards the west. Isilmo looks as well, and we see the top of a mountain coming in the distance. Valindiel, Isilmo says, "We're almost home. Oh, I never tire to see Meneltarma's sacred peak through the grey mists of the morning." He then stops himself and once more turns to his cousin, frowning. He leans over and speaks softly to him. I know how insufficient it would be, but perhaps would you like me to describe him to you? Valindiel smiles. There is no need. He stands up and moves towards the front of the boat, cloth now once again covering where his eyes used to be. I can see him just as clearly as you. Celebrimbor is in the process of leaving Moria. While doing so, Narvi enters the room and Celebrimbor turns to say his farewells. To his surprise, however, the dwarf seems to be in no mood for goodbyes. He walks up to Celebrimbor and paces. My friend, Celebrimbor says, I'm not going to stand for this, the dwarf says, still pacing. My father may be the king, but it is clear that he has let his desire for gold ruin his desire to serve the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. What are you saying? Narvi looks at his friend and smiles. The king demands loyalty and respect from his people by right, he says. As he is speaking, we see another group of dwarves run up and bow to Narvi, but he cannot expect them to obey so long as he is unjust. Celebrimbor looks horrified at the implication. Narvi, you elves are too scrupulous, the dwarf interrupts. Don't pretend as though you've forgotten what's at stake. You think that false messenger will stop with the damage done to a random tribe of men in a kingdom of dwarves? You think he'll suddenly stop his mischief with what he's done so far? Celebrimbor does not respond. Narvi comes close to him. Mark my words, Celebrimbor. Unless you create newer, better weapons than those rings, there will be no hope of winning in the end, let alone of restoring what is lost. Isn't that what you elves have been trying to do all this time? What do you hope to do? We, Narvi says, looking at his dwarvish companions, are going to raid the vaults.
The 6 of them begin sneaking throughout the city, making their way to the treasury with no one noticing them. Narvi attempts to enter through a side doorway, but they are found out shortly after entering and captured. The guards bring them to the dungeons, and while they are being brought, Narvi begins speaking in Sindarin. They share a few words of mutual encouragement, somewhat similar to what we see in the mining scene towards the end of the show, before Narvi reveals that he managed to snag some mithril and gold. He and his companion dwarves then attack the guards, and Narvi kicks Celebrimbor away, telling him to get out of Khazad-dûm as quickly as possible. Narvi is imprisoned. Durin, after a little bit of a montage, comes to his son in his prison. A look of disgust and disappointment overshadows anything else on his face. Why? Why would you steal from your own father? Narvi does not answer. Son, I am in no mood for this. Please, talk to me. Narvi looks at his father, stands up, and walks over to the bars. Father, throughout all my life I have served you, both as a son and as a subject. I have always believed that you were one of the strongest and most generous dwarves in the world. But ever since you let your suspicion of my friends fester within your heart, you have fallen. I already made my worst mistake by obeying your wicked command to steal from my friends, and now, his voice rises, you are so consumed by greed that you are willing to banish an elf over an ingot of gold and some myth. That's enough! Durin shouts. The stones throughout the prison ring out in the echo of his voice. You have already gone that far, have you? Very well. You are hereby stripped of all title and inheritance. I condemn you to be accounted the lowest of dwarves. Worse than a thief, you are to be branded a traitor alongside all those you have as accomplice. The dwarvish guard look extremely disturbed by this condemnation, but say nothing. Even Narvi is shocked by the suddenness and violence of his father's words. The king storms out of the dungeon. Nevertheless, we see Celebrimbor making it back to Ostendethil and beginning the forging of the new rings. He reaches the guild with a grim face, holding the 3 chunks of metal in hand. As many of his fellow smiths come to talk to him, he rushes past each of them and retreats to the inner forge. Days seem to pass without anyone seeing him, but we occasionally glimpse Celebrimbor at his work. We see great plans, and eventually the preparation of the forges with Tess, and eventually elves coming in and out running errands for him. Then, during the montage, he stops. One of his errand runners comes into the forge and sees him standing in the middle of the room, clearly halfway to his intended destination, as though time had suddenly stopped around him. Celebrimbor looks over to the elf, who acquires a nervous expression. Then, the master smith relaxes and goes over to a chair to sit down. Is everything all right, my lord? Celebrimbor wipes the sweat off of his brow. There's something wrong about all of this. The other elf says nothing. Elendil has already turned some of these rings to evil purpose, merely by giving them to people. I thought that creating new rings without his influence would be all the difference, but now that I come to the task, am I even worthy of this anymore? Are not the rings too dangerous in themselves? If the pursuit of such power has already caused so many issues, how can the pursuit of further power solve them? I have no ability to answer that, my lord. Celebrimbor looks up and, as if only just now recognizing the other elf, laughs with recognition upon seeing him. Still, he shakes his head and continues talking. I wonder if I am not merely playing into his hands. If I create the new rings, am I really creating them apart from his influence? Would it not be better to allow some younger smith, uncorrupted by any knowledge from the false envoy? You would be hard-pressed to find any such smith in the city, my lord. You speak truly. He turns to the other elf before saying, hesitantly, I fear we may have to cancel this project. The other elf looks dejected and bows before leaving. Celebrimbor, however, remains in his seat. The words of his friend continue to haunt him. Unless you create newer, better weapons than those rings, there will be no hope of winning in the end, let alone of restoring what is lost. We can see him struggling with a dilemma for minutes, if not hours, before he sits down and reads through some of his older journals, ostensibly merely to clear his head. He reads through some of the diagrams and descriptions of his older work with Narvi and the other smiths, as well as those of his sires and grandsire. Suddenly, something seems to click. He goes back over his plans and eventually scraps all of them, appearing to return to the basics of smithing. He refires the forges, the other elves notice, and one of the smiths goes to him. Well? The smith asks. We cannot remove the danger of the rings, Celebrimbor begins. But the smith, looking confused, interrupts. Then what's the point of the project going on? Did not you yourself say? You misunderstand. We cannot remove the danger of the rings, certainly not to the user, but what I can do is make them tools of protection.
healing, wisdom, preservation, rather than pure power. The smith raises an eyebrow. Celebrimbor continues. Elendil knows only how to contrive naked strength, control, manipulation. But we can do better. We have done better. Virtually all our arts are examples of power stemmed to a given purpose. Even my grandfather, who designed crafts of far greater power than we have, always gave purpose to his creations. He laughs excitedly and even turns from his work. Indeed, how could we have been so blind? Now that I see it, it is obvious. What do you mean? Elendil's task was not merely to have us create rings. Don't you see it now? Do you not remember how before the false messenger, we pursued the arts of light, letters, jewels, and doors? Our interests were as diverse and our skills as broad as they were spectacular. No. Elendil did not come just to stir strife. It came to corrupt our minds away from our ability to create tools of healing, of beauty, of wisdom, of nurture and protection, and to pursue only power. Now, I shall create the greatest tools of healing this world has ever seen. There are dangers with these rings, no doubt. For just as a medicine which cures an elf may kill a man, so too may these rings be perilous to mortals. But they will not be weapons. And as such, they shall prove to be far greater weapons against Elendil than any of the other rings could be. The smith smiles, finally understanding. He bows and moves to leave the room. If you need anything at all, my lord, we would all be pleased to assist you in whatever way we can. Celebrimbor returns to his labors and eventually finalizes his work on the new rings. 3 he creates, 2 of golden rim, 1 of mithril. On the first and most powerful of these, he sets a beautiful rounded sapphire, cut unlike what we see in the show. On the second, he puts a large ruby, and on the mithril ring, he sets a white gem. And all about the room, it seems as though the elements of air, water, and fire shift as he attempts to use each of the new rings. Eventually, he is satisfied with their power and exits the guild to present them to Celeborn. Celeborn seems eminently pleased by the results, especially once Celebrimbor explains their purpose. He immediately turns to one of his messengers and says, "Send a letter to the High King." In our next scene, we return to Marigold in the camp. We see the night has long progressed, as all the preparations for the escape have been made. The friendly Easterling gives the signal, and immediately the captives throughout the camp spring into action. They reveal knives and daggers which have been supplied to them as several members throw off their chains. The friendly Easterling likewise joins the action as the fighting turns into a sort of melee. Marigold, who recognizes herself as no good in a fight without a bow, attempts to help everyone coordinate by keeping herself away from the battle and shouting directions and signals to her companions. Eventually, we see that most of the soldiers who had been restraining the captives have died, and the friendly Easterling has a look of both relief and excitement on his face. Then, suddenly, an arrow goes through his stomach. He looks down in disbelief and falls to the ground. Marigold turns to see that Hamel and his own escort have come back to the sounds of battle and are about to make quick work of the captives. Within moments, many of them are slain, and they move to retreat into the nearby forests. This, however, is thwarted by the sight of wargs cutting off their escape, and immediately the chieftain and his subjects are thrown into despair. Marigold herself nearly gives up on her companions and makes to run when she feels something. She looks up at the sky with a questioning glance, it still being an overcast darkness indicative of night. Then she closes her eyes like one who stares too suddenly at a lamp early in the morning, or at the sun while exiting a cave. She grabs onto her grandmother's amulet and sees that the sun has already risen. The beauty of the morning seems to revive her spirits, and she turns to help her companions. It is then that she sees another sign of hope. For behind the pack of wargs shines a light even more fierce than the rising sun, Glorfindel. He is arrayed in full wrath with drawn sword and the terrible strength of Orome upon his face. He charges forth with a shout like a war horn, and the wargs disperse without resistance. Even the eldest and most fierce among them turn and run like beaten pups away from the battlefield, and far into the east, as if an army of elvish hunters had set their sights on each of them. Hamel and his men, however, take a different line. They begin to spread out, and the illusion of a thick forest and fog descends upon the land. Despite this, it is not long before Glorfindel finds Marigold and rejoices to see her, though his joy is not without sternness. "Glorfindel," she says, both cheerfully and cautiously before suddenly stopping. Her face seems shrouded with dizziness and fatigue. Glorfindel also senses Camel's illusions begin to take effect, prepares to break them for himself. But there is also concern in his eyes, for he now fears that he will have to defend Marigold and the other men in addition to looking after himself. Just as he is ready to break the illusion, however, Marigold pretends to sway a bit before pulling out a knife and throwing it at a tree. An animalistic cry comes from it, and the illusions are broken. The two of them then see Hamel fall off his horse, and Marigold expresses frustration. "Damn," she says. "I thought that would hit his neck." You can see through the illusions? Glorfindel says in surprise. Yep, pretty good, right? Which reminds me, does the world look like night to you right now? Yes, why? Before she can answer, however, Glorfindel notices that Hamel has stood up and drawn his sword. Instantly he is upon the wicked king, but just as quickly his guards block the elves' blows, and Glorfindel is caught in the middle of a battle. He strikes at each with immense speed, but they show surprising skill in holding him off for a time. Eventually, however, each is slain, buying only just enough time for Hamel to gain a decent distance and mount a new horse. Glorfindel chases after the horse. Marigold yells out to him to stop. Glorfindel apologizes, but says that he cannot let the opportunity slip. Marigold runs after him as fast as she can, but to no avail. The horse speeds away, heading towards the trees, but Glorfindel catches up to it. He throws his sword as if it were a spear, and pierces the back of the Easterling. Hamel falls to the ground, the horse still charging away, as his blood soaks into the grass underneath. He lies still, motionless, as Glorfindel walks up to him. The elf breathes a sigh of relief that this stage of his task is now at last done, when once again he hears Marigold's shouts behind him. He looks around in the darkness, making sure that no other Easterling has come, though he seems uncertain whether this is necessary, and goes to Marigold.
That's not the real one,
he hears her yelling. He pauses as his mind processes the words. Then, his eyes widen and he turns around, focusing his mind. Once more we hear a sound like the breaking of glass, and the night in the forest disappears. It is now mid-morning, and the body of the Easterling chieftain disappears. Glorfindel sighs in frustration, but relaxes nonetheless. The fiery glow within him subsides, and he returns to a subtler, more ordinary elvish look. He turns to see Marigold still running towards him, and he walks to meet her. When they finally reach each other, Marigold is completely out of breath. The two of them go to the top of the hill, and Marigold immediately starts hypothesizing about all the places he could have gone to get back to the east. Glorfindel expresses just how impressed he is verbally, and makes his declaration that he has decided to change course. Clearly, there's far more going on in the east than he or the Valar were aware of. Therefore, for the time being, he must turn aside from his journey to the Elvish realms to understand and sabotage the efforts of the enemy if he can. He turns to offer Marigold the opportunity to come with him, noting that she will have to learn how to truly survive out in the wild, away from family, friends, and comforts. She accepts. Glorfindel picks her up and begins to sprint into the distance. We then see a group of dwarves approach Narvi in his prison. Narvi seems rather distressed and asks only for news of Celebrimbor. They tell him that the elf escaped without harm, but that the king has cut off all communication with Eregion. Narvi then asks if the Lady Galadriel has been harmed, and they say no, that she made her way through Moria without incident. At last, Narvi seems somewhat relieved by this, but the dwarves insist that they continue talking to him, noting that his imprisonment has raised several eyebrows and caused many suspicions of Durin to flare up. Narvi becomes interested in this, and the dwarves continue by noting that Durin has been acting strangely for weeks now. Narvi frowns at this, knowing the cause, and wondering how many people heard what he said in the throne room. His friends then assure him, Durin is king, it is true. But we fear there is a feud brewing in Khazad-dûm. Don't worry, one of them says. We'll find a way to get you out of this prison. This isn't over. I'll make sure of it. And then in our last scene, we have a shot of an extremely overcast hillside. Indeed, it is so dark it could almost be the middle of a thunderstorm, though there is no rain. In the distance, there is a dense tree line, while in the background we hear uneven footfall until an extremely tired man walks past the camera. His clothes are tattered, and he even has a slight limp, though this is clearly no major hindrance, as he quickly dashes into hiding as soon as he hears a group of orcs approaching the area. He waits until they are gone, and then continues onwards. We then see that his hair is matted with dirt and that he is holding something in his hands, though we cannot see what. He continues onwards and makes his way down a gentle slope until he finally makes it to the forests. He turns around and we see that it is Minister. In an extremely brief flashback, we see that he managed to incapacitate one of the orcs who was leading him to be sacrificed by pretending to be far weaker than he actually was. And that, after finding a secure place to hide from the orcs, he witnessed the sacrificing of Adar in his place, as well as the eruption of Mount Doom. It seems that now he is free, but there is no hope in his eyes. For as he turns around to look once more at the arid Lithwi from which he has just climbed down, the camera pans up, and once more we see Mordor with all its pits, trenches, furnaces, camps, and endless fields of ash and smog. Great tribes of orcs have gathered and nearly fill the land, while smaller groups of men, primarily Easterlings, have camps and sections of their own. All the while, the camera zooms towards the erupting mountain, inching closer to the Samath Naur, atop the stairwell chiseled into the side of Araduin. As it approaches, we hear the noise of a great forge, and eventually, when we pierce through the endless smog belching forth from the crack of doom, the sounds of the hammering die down, and all is, for a moment, still and dark. But as the scene brightens, akin to how eyes adjust to new light, we see a great, fair form rise from his work and hold it aloft. The camera continues to brighten as he slips the golden ring onto his finger, and as the fiery words begin to glow brighter and brighter, the camera begins to fade to black, and we hear those dreadful words. Ashnaz Duratuluk, Ashnaz Gimbatul, Ashnaz Thrakatuluk, Agburzumishi Krimbatu.